is maintenance of international peace and security, the impact of climate change and food security. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, the heads of state, distinguished ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Austria, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belgium, Belize, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Brazil, Bulgaria, Cambodia, Canada, Chile, Croatia, Czech, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Dominican Republic, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Federated States of Micronesia, Germany, Georgia, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Jamaica, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Kenya, Liechtenstein, Maldives, Mauritania, Mauritius, Mexico, Morocco, Myanmar, Namibia, Nauru, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Nigeria, Norway, Pakistan, Palau, Panama, Paraguay, Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, Romania, Singapore, South Africa, South Sudan, Spain, Suriname, Syrian Arab Republic, Thailand, Turkey, Ukraine, United Arab Emirates, Vanuatu, Vietnam, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Simon Steele, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ms. Beth Beckdahl, Deputy Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and Ms. Livia Roche, Director of Global Initiatives and Head of Climate, Peace, and Sustainable Development of the International Peace Institute. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in this meeting. His Excellency, Mr. Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, and Ms. Letitia Courtois, Permanent Observer and Head of Delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of the Council members to document S/2024/146, a letter dated 6 February 2024, from the Permanent Representative of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank the Government of Guyana for bringing us together to focus on the impact of the climate crisis and food insecurity on global peace and security. Climate chaos and food crises are serious and mounting threats to global peace and security, and it's only right that they are addressed by this Council. A global food crisis is creating a hellscape of hunger and heartache for many of the world's poorest people. And the climate crisis is accelerating with a deadly force, and last year was the hottest ever. Both these facts undermine peace. Empty bellies fuel unrest. In Portugal, we have a saying, "In a house with no bread, everyone argues and no one is right." Climate disasters and conflict both inflame inequalities, imperil livelihoods, and force people from their homes. That can strain relations, stoke mistrust, and sow discontent. While diminished resources and mass displacement can intensify competition, conflict can easily be sparked where tensions are high, institutions are weak, and people are marginalized. And women and girls pay the highest price, just as they do when food is short and climate disasters hit. Excellencies, at the same time, climate and conflict are two leading drivers of global food crisis. Where wars rage, anger reigns. Whether due to the displacement of people, destruction of agriculture, damage to infrastructure, or deliberate policies of denial. Meanwhile, climate chaos is imperiling food production the world over. Floods and droughts destroy crops. Ocean changes disrupt fishing. Rising seas degrade land and fresh water, and shifting weather patterns ruin harvests and spawn pests. Climate and conflict were the main causes of acute food insecurity for almost 174 million people in 2022. And in many cases, they collide to its communities with a double blow. Excellencies, I am dismayed to say that our world today is teeming with examples of the devastating relationship between hunger and conflict. In Syria, almost 13 million people go to bed hungry after a decade of war and a horrendous earthquake. In Myanmar, conflict and political instability have thrown progress towards ending hunger into reverse. In Gaza, no one has enough to eat. Of the 700,000 hungriest people in the world, 4 in 5 inhabit that tiny strip of land. In many places, climate disasters add another dimension. Every one of the 14 countries most at risk from climate change are suffering conflict. 13 of them face humanitarian crises this year. In Haiti, hurricanes combine with violence and lawlessness to create a humanitarian crisis for millions. In Ethiopia, drought comes hot on the heels of war. Almost 16 million people are estimated to require food assistance this year. And refugees from the conflict in neighboring Sudan are adding pressure on already scarce resources. In the Sahel, rising temperatures are rising tensions, drying up water resources, wrecking grazing land, and ruining smallholder agriculture, the staple of local economies. Against a backdrop of long-standing political instability, conflict between farmers and herders is the result. Meanwhile, globally, we risk resurgence of food inflation as drought sap the Panama Canal and violence hits the Red Sea, throwing supply chains into disarray. Excellencies, without action, the situation will deteriorate. Conflicts are multiplying. The climate crisis is set to spiral as emissions continue to rise, and acute food insecurity has been increasing year on year. The World Food Programme estimates that over 330 million people were affected in 2023, and it has warned of an acute deterioration in 18 hunger hotspots earlier this year. To avoid mounting threats to international peace and security, we must step in and act now to break the deadly links between conflict, climate, and food insecurity. First, all parties to all conflicts must abide by international humanitarian law. Far too often, this is not the case. Security Council Resolution 2417 on the protection of civilians in armed conflict is clear. Goods essential to civilians' survival must be protected. Starvation of civilians may constitute a war crime, and humanitarians must have unimpeded access to civilians in need. This Council has a critical role in demanding compliance and holding those who breach the resolution to account. Second, we must fund humanitarian operations in full to prevent disaster and conflict from feeding hunger. Last year, humanitarian operations were less than 40% funded. Around a third of the money for these operations was earmarked for tackling food insecurity. Third, we must create the conditions to resolve conflict and preserve peace within countries and between countries. Exclusion, inequalities, and poverty all increase the risk of conflict. Turbocharging progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, including our goal of zero hunger, is the answer. We need massive investment in a just transformation to healthy, equitable, and sustainable food systems. And we need governments, business, and society working together to make such systems a reality. Today, we see a grotesque disparity between allocation and need. Globally, almost a third of food is wasted, while hundreds of millions of people go to bed hungry every night. And food consumption, production, and distribution are responsible for around a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. We must create food systems that feed the planet without wrecking the planet. That means aligning climate action and food systems transformation, as I called for at the UN Food Systems Stocktake last July, to help secure sustainable development, good livelihoods, and healthy people on an healthy planet. This requires working together and bringing all people, women, young people, and marginalized communities into decision-making. We must also build and finance social protection systems to protect livelihoods and ensure basic access to services and resources. And we must strengthen and renew global peace and security frameworks. It is vital that we make the most of the Summit of the Future later this year, where member states will consider the proposed new agenda for peace. This presents a comprehensive vision for peace in our changing world, based on prevention and international law and anchored in human rights. And it recognizes the links between sustainable development, climate action, and peace. Fourth, we must get a grip on the climate crisis to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because climate action is action for food security and action for peace. G20 nations must lead the just global phase-out of fossil fuels in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. But all countries must create ambitious new national climate action plans or nationally determined contributions by 2025 that align with the 1.5 degree limit. We must also get serious about adaptation, ensuring every person on Earth is protected by an early warning system by 2027, and that early warning leads to early action, and delivering adequate adaptation finance. Developed countries must clarify how they will honor the promise of $40 billion a year in adaptation finance by 2025, and they must show how the adaptation finance gap will be closed. We also need substantial contributions to the new loss and damage fund established in COP28. And we need to support local institutions to take the lead in reducing disaster risk in their areas. Cinquièmement, nous devons agir en matière de financement. La réalisation des objectifs de développement durable représente sans conteste le meilleur moyen de prévenir les conflits. Mais cela demande des investissements. Aujourd'hui, accablés par la crise du coût de la vie et des niveaux d'endettement insoutenables, de nombreux pays en développement ne peuvent tout simplement pas se permettre d'investir dans l'action climatique, dans des systèmes alimentaires résilients ou d'autres priorités en matière de développement durable. J'ai proposé un plan de relance des objectifs de développement durable à la hauteur de 500 milliards de dollars par an pour un financement abordable et à long terme du développement durable et de l'action climatique. Pour cela, il faut prendre des mesures urgentes en matière de dette, en accordant du répit aux pays qui devront faire face à des remboursements écrasants au cours des 3 prochaines années. Il faut également recapitaliser les banques multilatérales de développement et changer leurs modèles économiques afin de permettre de mobiliser bien plus de financement privé à un coût raisonnable pour les pays en développement. Dans le même temps, les pays en développement doivent donner la priorité aux dépenses relatives à la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable. Il est affligeant de voir des gouvernements dépenser sans compter dans l'armement, tout en réduisant en peu de chagrin les budgets consacrés à la sécurité alimentaire, à l'action climatique et au développement durable en général. Enfin, nous devons cibler les points de convergence entre l'insécurité alimentaire, le climat et les conflits. Nous devons créer des partenariats, des politiques publiques et des programmes qui permettent de répondre à ces enjeux de façon simultanée. Par exemple, en prenant en compte les risques climatiques et la sécurité alimentaire dans la consolidation de la paix, ou en investissant dans les programmes d'adaptation climatique qui aident les populations à gérer les ressources communes. Le mécanisme de sécurité climatique des Nations Unies a été conçu pour prendre en compte les liens entre le climat, la paix et la sécurité dans notre travail. L'initiative Convergence a été lancée l'année dernière pour aider les pays à associer l'action climatique et la transformation des systèmes alimentaires. Nous devons également veiller à ce que le financement de l'action climatique atteigne les personnes et les lieux en proie à des conflits. Le Fonds pour la consolidation de la paix peut servir de catalyseur afin de mobiliser d'autres partenaires et faire de cette ambition une réalité. Et je demande au Conseil de sécurité de réfléchir à la meilleure façon de faire face aux menaces interdépendantes sur le climat, la sécurité alimentaire et la paix et sécurité internationale. Excellencies, the message is clear. We can break the deadly nexus of anger, climate chaos and conflict and quell the threat they pose to international peace and security. Let us act to do so and build a livable, sustainable future free from hunger and free from the scourge of war. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Simon Steele.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I want to begin today by thanking Guyana for bringing this important topic to the attention of the Security Council, because there's no two ways about it. The less that is done to tackle climate change, the more conflicts this chamber will be faced with. Only a few years ago, the world believed we could eradicate hunger. Today, 1 in 10 people on Earth already suffers from chronic hunger. That number is unacceptable. If climate change accelerates, it will only become worse. Climate change is contributing to food insecurity and to conflict. Rapid, sustained action to cut greenhouse gas emissions and to increase resilience is needed now to help stop both from spiraling out of control. The world is heating fast. Rainfall patterns are changing, and storms are becoming stronger and far more destructive. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, food production is already lower than it would have been without climate change. And in the not-too-distant future, we risk huge supply shocks where harvests fail simultaneously in major producer countries. If heating continues, food production will decline across many countries. In others, little will grow at all. Food shortages, price spikes, and hunger are likely. Without climate action, they're almost certain. The links between hunger and conflict are well established. Historically, bread riots have fueled revolutions and toppled governments. Competition for arable land becomes fiercer in times of heat and drought. Food scarcity has fueled intercommunal violence within countries and between them. The combination of climate change, hunger, and war is a devastating one. There is no national security without food security. And there will be no food security without enhanced action to stop climate change. But I'm not here today just to present problems, because for all of these problems, there are solutions and ways forward, both inside this forum and other fora, including the UNFCCC process. At the UNFCCC, our mandate does not expand to decision-making on peace and security. We can and do acknowledge the role climate change and food security play in driving conflict in our reports. We can build partnerships and establish collaborations to address exacerbating factors. But it is my view that this Council also has a role to play. We must acknowledge more can be done rather than hoping the problem will go away, which of course it won't. This Council should be requesting a regular stream of information on climate security risks. The UNFCCC can help in the development of these updates. But ultimately, this forum should be abreast of this crisis driver in real time to aid in better decision-making. For example, where the programming of vertical funds now acknowledge conflict sensitivity, they should also be climate sensitive. From the UNFCCC's perspective, national adaptation plans, climate finance, and new and stronger nationally determined contributions can reduce our vulnerability and, alongside with the measures outlined by others here today, help prevent hunger and conflict. Let me go through each of these important tools. Every country needs to implement a national climate adaptation plan to protect its people, its livelihoods, and nature from spiraling climate impacts. And every national adaptation plan submitted to us to date identifies increasing food security as a top priority. Investment in climate resilience and adaptation, including change in agricultural practices towards regenerative food production, while working to nurture and conserve nature, would not only blunt the damage from extreme climate events, but can also ensure that future food security needs are ensured sustainably and universally, leaving no one behind. At COP28 in Dubai, countries agreed that now is the time to invest in designing, piloting, and delivering climate adaptation plans for food systems. From planting new crops to better meteorological information and communication. Countries need money for adaptation, particularly developing countries that are vulnerable to climate shocks. Many of these same countries are already facing scarcity, fragility, and conflict. But we face significant gaps in funding for climate action, and adaptation finance needs are at least 10 times greater than current international public financial flows. Developing countries, excluding China, need $2.4 trillion every year to build clean energy economies and adapt to climate impacts. These are large numbers, but they're investments in the future compared to the spiraling costs of crisis and conflict. They pale. And unlike rebuilding after war or natural catastrophes, adaptation funding is productive. It's an investment in better societies. Climate finance is an investment in thriving economies, in abundance, not scarcity, in preventing the conditions that cause conflict. Done right, climate finance will benefit countries with significant humanitarian needs. But today, not enough finance flows to extremely fragile and conflict-ridden states. That too must change. Honourable Council members, while adapting to a warming world is now imperative, we must also do our utmost to limit dangerous further rises in temperature. Our tool for this is the nationally determined contributions, national climate targets and plans. These action plans must be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, cover every greenhouse gas, and lay out how each sector of the economy will transition. And in light of today's conversation, they must include measures to protect food security. All countries are due to submit these new plans by early next year. They need to be ambitious and keep alive the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Investment in adaptation, resilience, and clean energy can increase prosperity and food security and help avoid future conflicts. Done right, climate action can help build peace. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Steele for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Beth Bechtel.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I too would like to start by thanking the President of Guyana for convening this meeting and inviting the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN to speak. Climate and conflict are the most important issues representing urgent action to address global food insecurity. The scientific evidence and the policy direction are clear. Climate change is compromising food security, and its impacts are a growing threat to international peace and security. It is having an alarming effect on people, the planet, and what I would like to address this morning, agri-food systems, meaning how and when we produce, harvest, process, and store our food. Increasing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and greater frequency of climate extremes are already a reality and are becoming more intense. The climate crisis spares no one, but it does not affect everyone equally or in the same way. We know that the populations at greatest risk are those that depend on agriculture and natural resources. They live in rural areas and they are farmers themselves. Their livelihoods are highly exposed and are vulnerable to climate change impacts, therefore limiting their capacity to respond and making them prone to disputes arising from the scarcity of these natural resources. Strong, viable livelihoods are central to mitigating these climate-related security risks. When threatened, it creates an important pathway for how climate change can contribute to the risk of conflict. For FAO, as a specialized technical agency of the UN system, focused specifically on food and agriculture, we increasingly find ourselves in this very space. We have heard it said many times, there is no food security without peace and no peace without food security. But now, more and more, we are dealing with the impacts of climate change. We have seen firsthand how conflict leads to hunger and malnutrition, and it is no coincidence that half of the world's hungry people live in conflict-affected zones. According to the 2023 Global Report on Food Crises, the main drivers of food insecurity and hunger around the world are conflict and climate change. 258 million people in 58 countries are facing high levels of acute food insecurity, IPC phase 3 or above, and over 2/3 are there because of climate and conflict. That is 174 million people. And while there may not be a direct causality between the two, there is clear evidence that climate change increases risks and drivers of conflict and instability, such as disputes over land and water, and that conflict contributes to climate change vulnerability, especially for people who are forced to leave their homes and migrate. As much as 70% of the most climate vulnerable countries are also among the most politically and economically fragile. Climate change will undo the progress that has been made in alleviating hunger, but as it intensifies, it will create further disruptions and continue to be a driver of conflict. It is projected that 10% of the currently suitable area for major crops and livestock could be climatically unsuitable by mid-century under high-emission scenarios. This is a further reduction of an already limited area that we depend on to produce our food. And it is this scenario, it is all farmers, small-scale farmers, pastoralists, foresters, and fisherfolk who bear the brunt of climate impacts due to their dependence on natural resources, soil, water, and land. I see this on my own family's farm in the Midwest of the United States, and I see it firsthand in places like Afghanistan, Kenya, Somalia, Uganda, and elsewhere. Conflict impacts the ability of communities to produce and access food. It reduces agricultural yields and productivity. It displaces farmers from their lands. It destroys agricultural assets, disrupts markets and services, increases prices, and even introduces new risks for human health. We have to equip farmers and communities to prepare for and respond to these crises and to recover quickly from them. We have to help them build resilience. We are actually seeing the results of these efforts in a place like Afghanistan. We are starting to see a significant decline of the population facing acute food insecurity. And we know these approaches can work. We just need to scale them up. The Secretary General's Peace Building Fund has been responding effectively to the need to address the intersection of climate change and conflict and the effects of heightened competition over natural resources. It works, and FAO remains committed to supporting these types of projects and to strengthen collaboration with partners. The relationship between climate change and conflict is complex. It's context-specific, and it's multidimensional. Let me share just a few examples. In West and Central Africa, cross-border transhumance is a long-standing traditional pastoral practice. It is when herders migrate seasonally, crossing borders with their livestock in search of water and pasture. Historically, it has been peaceful, but climate change and environmental and security pressures have altered these migratory routes. This has led to a steady increase in tensions within agriculture between farming and herding communities, often linked to growing competition for already scarce natural resources such as water and land, or to damage incurred to crops in the fields. This problem exists in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and Niger, where FAO and the IOM are working together to reduce violent conflicts linked to transhumance through an alert system and mechanisms for conflict management. This is just a glimpse of our work with herders and pastoralists. But as you know, climate change and conflict affects all agricultural sectors, not just livestock. It affects crop production, fisheries, and forestry, which are intimately and inextricably linked to climate change. And it creates additional pressures on accessing natural resources. In Yemen, FAO has implemented a Water for Peace project, which has helped to mitigate water-based conflicts, with women often as the conflict resolution agents. Through Cash for Work, participating communities in protected areas where water flows during rainfall and rehabilitated irrigation canals are the focus. Farming communities engaged under the project to resolve local conflicts over upstream and downstream water allocation is prioritized. Climate change and the security risks it presents knows no geographical boundaries. Therefore, cooperation is needed at all levels to ensure the peaceful and sustainable management of shared resources. To continue to advance this agenda, let me close by recommending the following 5 actions. 1, prioritize investments. We need to build climate-resilient agri-food systems and local approaches that help build and sustain peace, drawing on climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and community-based approaches. 2, please request UN entities to regularly analyze and report on risks and links associated with climate change. Data and information are key for targeted interventions. 3, improve strategic coordination at all levels and leverage existing mechanisms, such as the UN Climate Security Mechanism and IGAD's Climate Security Coordination Mechanism. 4th, source specialized climate, peace, and security advisor roles in more UN missions, especially those susceptible to climate change. And last, establish regional climate, peace, and security hubs, such as was done by the Office of the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. I'll conclude by simply saying that we cannot neglect agriculture as a key solution to the growing threats from climate change, conflict, and their impacts on food security. It is time for us to focus on farmers, on pastoralists, on fisherfolk, on foresters, the people who feed this world, and we cannot afford to leave them behind. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Beckdahl for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Himia Livia Roche.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Dr. Mohamed Irfan Ali, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for placing this issue as top priority for Guyana. 10 years ago, I was sitting at this horseshoe table as an elected member for Guatemala's delegation. It is a great honor now to speak as the International Peace Institute. I know firsthand how difficult it is to figure out where climate change fits in the Security Council. It's been a very long journey, and I've been a skeptic myself. Climate change is like no other issue in the Council's agenda. It's not boots in the ground. It's not an enemy we can condemn, name, or sanction. It challenges all our known assumptions on what an enemy is, and because of this, it could actually unify humanity. Climate change is by far where the highest collaboration exists between countries and where multilateralism thrives. The UNFCCC is the central place for its diplomacy, but the Convention and the Paris Agreement do not address peace and security. That's the remit of this body, and Simon emphasized that as well. The question is, how can the Council respond to the calls so many developing countries have made, from Niger to the Dominican Republic here, from Mozambique to the Pacific Island states, and now Guyana? Many countries keep knocking at the Council's door. When will the Council respond? Not if, when? Mr. President, the planet is warming at an accelerated rate, and we're dangerously close to 1.5 degrees. The highest scientific body is unequivocal on how all our human systems will be impacted once we cross that threshold. And it's not science fiction, but it's hard to imagine these scenarios because indeed they're so apocalyptic. And any of us that are parents, or dare I say grandparents, this should send chills to our spine. But does this mean that we prefer to ignore them? The oceans and forests, our greatest carbon sinks, soon will not be able to keep providing this noble service. Extreme heat will become an unbearable reality, affecting crops, waters, and our own very survival. Human mobility will be unprecedented, more than we have ever experienced, and our record on migration is appalling. Warm water coral reefs will cease to exist, deeply affecting global fish stocks and countries that depend on it. And as rising oceans claim lands and islands, entire cultures teeter on the brink, their ancestral homes vanishing beneath the waves. Mr. President, what then is the role of the Council? First, we need to rethink the link between sovereignty and territory laws enshrined in the Montevideo Principles, as island states will need to keep their sovereignty even when they lose their lands. The pushback on climate experience in the Council has left a significant gap in responsibility, particularly for SIDS that do not have a specific agenda in the Council and yet face this existential threat. As we move closer to warming beyond 1.5, countries will experience compounding extreme events, disasters, and economic shocks. For many middle-income countries, this is coupled with high debt and unfair rules in global trade and finance, as the Secretary General mentioned. These climate impacts amplify inequality, leaving women, children, and the disabled disproportionately affected. The poor and vulnerable will be even more poor and more vulnerable. The role of this solemn body is not to replace the UNFCCC. A role for the Council is to examine how climate magnifies existing realities, including and beyond the countries in the Council's agenda, related to peace and security. To do this, it can invoke Article 34, which, to paraphrase, the Security Council may investigate any situation which might lead to international friction or give rise to a dispute or situation likely to endanger the maintenance of peace and security. Once again, I would like to say may investigate any situation. Members of the Security Council could set up a provisional investigative body to better understand the link between food security, climate, and conflict at current warming levels. Setting up this body under Article 34 could help clarify in a serious and scientific manner what could be the role of the Council. It needs to be a space that includes all range of views on this issue, held by permanent and elected members. All members need to be seized. If we set up this body, and IPI would be happy to help, it would send a new message to the world that the Security Council is serious about the smallest of nations, because after all, isn't that the purpose of the UN? To protect the smallest. Mr. President, the Security Council is not alone in trying to figure out how to address climate change. The World Bank, the IMF, face a similar challenge. All our institutions established in 1945 need expanded mandates. Here, the Charter provides the mandate through Article 34. It is mostly about expanding its practice. There is good news, though. The resources are there to transform food systems. We just need the leadership and the will to repurpose 638 billion subsidies that go against climate-positive investments and barely trickle down to the farmer. The money is there. So, climate is a challenge that, unlike many others in the Council, is not intractable. It can be solved through cooperation, innovation, and a deep commitment to our shared future. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Roche for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. His Excellency, Secretary General, Excellencies, the challenges to international peace and security continue to evolve, and our understanding and approach to these challenges must also continue to evolve to effectively address them. I therefore welcome the perspective offered by the Secretary General and our briefers. The interrelationship between climate change, food security, and peace and security is clear. Climate change and conflict are two of the main drivers of food insecurity and often overlap, creating a vicious cycle of instability and need. The assessment is that climate change is expected to grow significantly as a driver of conflict. We recognize, too, that armed conflict can induce food insecurity and the threat of famine. Please allow me, therefore, to dwell for a few moments on these issues. And many may ask whether this situation is a crisis or not, or whether these topics are even relevant for the Security Council and are a priority for discussion at this level. Just to allow those who may have these lingering questions an understanding of whether it's a crisis or not, I wish to point to some current facts. As we gather here today, an estimated 149 million Africans are facing acute food insecurity, an increase of 12 million people from a year ago. This equates to a risk category of 3 or higher: crisis, emergency, and catastrophe. On the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Scale 1 to 5, some 122 million of those facing acute food insecurity are in countries experiencing conflict. 82% of the total, accentuating that conflict is the primary driver of acute food insecurity in Africa. And the same can be said about Haiti. Internal conflict being a key contributor to food insecurity, climate insecurity, that ultimately leads to governance issues. Based on the Africa Improved Foods forecasts, it will cost US $5 billion to eradicate hunger caused by war. And then we have the issue of agricultural land taken out of production due to war. In Ukraine, the overall value of the damages and losses for agricultural enterprises is estimated at almost $4 billion US. Most times, these are small to medium-sized farmers with no insurance policies. That is millions of families we're sending to the poverty line as a result of war. We don't speak about it, we don't calculate it, we don't put it in the equation, but this is the reality. My friends, in Colombia, in 2011, the Commission to Monitor Public Policies on Forced Displacement stated that between 1980 and July 2010, 6.6 million hectares of land has been abandoned or seized as a consequence of conflict. as a consequence of conflict. These stats and all that I'm saying are publicly available. What have we done about it? We have done very little because we do not see the interplay and we do not place priority on these issues as a consequence of war and conflict. Then let's look at the issue of war-induced displacement and forced migration. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR, has identified at least 108 million forcibly displaced people, including 35.3 million refugees and more than 62 million people who are internally displaced because of conflict and other factors. Of these individuals, 76% live in low and middle-income countries. 76% live in low and middle-income countries. Let us look at the issue of deforestation in conflict areas. In total, and across all conflict areas assessed, forest loss increased by 10% in 2020. Did we hear about this at COP? Did we hear about the deforestation as a result of war and conflict? That increased by 10% in 2020. That is 3.2 million hectares. Based on the woody biomass loss in tropical areas only, this amounts to approximately 1.1 megatons of CO2. Nearly 4 times the total emissions from the UK in 2020. This is the reality of conflict and war and deforestation and climate. How are we placing this in the equation of net zero? Is it in the equation because we are not seeing a decrease in conflict and wars? Let us move to another issue, land degradation. Go back to Ukraine. The war has destroyed $2.1 billion worth of farmland and unharvested winter crops. This is the cost. $2.1 billion worth of farmland and unharvested winter crops. Let us look at the issue of pollution. In 2019 alone, the US military emitted 57 million tons of CO2. With the war in Iraq generating over 141 million tons of CO2 emissions in 4 years. 141 million tons of emission in 4 years. This is the equivalent of 20 million cars in 1 year. We are talking about EVs. That war over 4 years equate to 25 million cars. The emission of 25 million cars in 1 year. The total amount of emission after 18 months of war in the Ukraine is estimated to be 150 million tons of CO2, which is more than the annual emission of highly developed countries like Belgium. It has been estimated that in the first 35 days of the Israel-Gaza conflict war, emissions amounting to approximately 60.3 million tons of carbon equivalent were discharged. Some analysts project that the total emission could escalate to an alarming 629 million tons of carbon should the conflict continue for a year. 629 million tons of carbon. And this is the conflicts and war as they exist. We have not yet calculated the impact on the environment and food in the rebuilding phase. That is another calculation that should be added to the equation. The question is, most times, it is the developing world that carries the greatest burden. Are we going to be bold enough to calculate these damages and assign a value to the damage as a result of conflict and war? Are we going to be bold enough to even address the level of criminality that exists in creating such damage? And that is why we believe in Guyana that this is a matter for the Security Council, because these are issues that are addressed by the Security Council. But the component that constitute food and climate are sometimes missing from the overall analysis of the impact of war and conflict. I'm not going to go into generational disruptions. The movement of people, the Secretary General often speak about the impact. I'm not going to go into the dysfunctionality as a result of social costs and its impact, because social costs drive people most times back to subsistence living. When they would utilize the forests, they would move to new areas, they would clear new areas. These are all issues that must be taken into account as we address this issue. So, my friends, we believe strongly that a very targeted approach must be adopted. The Security Council must take in account the consequential effects on food security and climate in addressing the issues of conflict and war. And these issues are intricately linked to the rule of law, democracy, and governance. They are all interconnected. We, therefore, are of the very strong view that the Security Council should outline a series of steps that must include a full analysis of the impact. And just as we adopt measures to safeguard humanitarian interests, we must adopt measures in our procedures to deal with the effect on food and climate. At a minimum, we must be bold enough. We have the ability. We have the political will. We must now incorporate measures at the UN Security Council to deal with climate and food as it relates to wars and conflict. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Youssef Sherfa, Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development of Algeria.
سيد الرئيس،
Mr. President,
أصحاب المعالي،
Your Excellencies,
سيدات والسادة،
ladies and gentlemen,
أود في مستهل مداخلتي
at the outset,
أن أنقل لرئيس
I would
جمهورية
like to
غيانا
convey to His
السيد
Excellency,
محمد
the President
إفران
of
علي
Guyana, Mr.
تحية
Mohammed
أخيه
Irfan Ali,
رئيس الجمهورية
the greetings
الجزائرية
of his brother,
السيد عبد
the
المجيد تبون،
President of Algeria, Mr. Abdul Majid
معربا
Tebboune.
له عن شكره
I would like to
وتقديره
express
على دعوته لعقد
him
هذه الجلسة
our thanks and
الموضوعية
appreciation
الهامة والتي
for the
تخصص
invitation
لمناقشة العلاقة
to convene this
المعقدة
thematic important meeting
والترابطية
which
بين
discusses
المناخ
this complex
والأمن
interlinked
الغذائي
relation
والنزاعات.
between
كما لا
climate
يفوتني
security,
أن نتوجه بالشكر
food security and
للأمين العام
conflict. I would also
لمنظمتنا
like to thank
سيد أنطونيو
the Secretary
غوتيريش
General
على
of the United
إحاطته
Nations,
الشاملة
Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his
وثمنا في ذات
comprehensive
الوقت
briefing.
الإسهامات القيمة
I also
للسيد سيمون
commend
ستيل
the valuable
الأمين
contributions
التنفيذي
of
الاتفاقية
Mr.
الإطارية
Simon
لأمم
Still, the
المتحدة
Executive Secretary
حول
of the United
تغيير
Nations
المناخ.
Framework Convention on Climate
وللسيدة
Change,
باث بيكدول
and
نائبة
Ms.
المدير
Beth
العام
Bigdol, the Deputy
للمنظمة
Director General
الأغذية
of the
والزراعة
Food and
للأمم
Agriculture
المتحدة
Organization of the United
وكذا
Nations,
للأخت
and Ms.
خيمانا لي فاروخ في
Ximena
إثراء
Livia
نقاش
Roche.
المجلس.
I thank them all for
سيد
enriching
الرئيس،
our discussion.
سيدات والسادة،
Mr. President, ladies and
إن
gentlemen,
ظاهرة تغير المناخ تشكل بما لا يدع
no doubt climate
مجال
change
للشكل مضاعفا
is a threat
للتهديدات
multiplier.
التي تواجهها دولنا
It multiplies the
بدرجات
threats
متوافدة.
facing our states in
فارتفاع
varying
درجات
degrees.
الحرارة
Rising
والتغير
temperatures,
أنماط الطقس
changing
وارتفاع
weather
مستويات
patterns,
سطح البحر
sea level rise
كلها عوامل
are all
تعيق
factors
الإنتاج الزراعي
that
وتدفع
disrupt
إلى
agricultural
التنقل
production,
القسري للسكان
drive people
وتزيد من
to
حدة
forcibly move
التنافس
and heighten
على الموارد الحيوية
competition
مثل
over
المياه
vital
والأراضي
resources like water and
وغذية
lands,
في ذات الوقت
thus
النزاعات
fueling
وعدم
conflict
الاستقرار
and instability,
لا سيما في
in
المناطق
particular in
الهشة
vulnerable and
والمتأثرة
conflict-affected areas,
بالنزاعات مما ينعكس سلبا على استقرار
which has a
وأمن
negative
الدول
impact
الجنوب
on
ويعمق
the stability and
الفوارق
security
في النمو.
of countries of the South
في هذا
and
السياق
deepens growth disparities.
تسعى دولنا لإيجاد
In
حلول
this vein,
عملية
our countries
تسمح لها
seek to find
بتوفير
practical
الغذاء
solutions that enable
ومجابهة
them to provide
تغير
food
المناخ
and address
بما
climate change,
يسد احتياجاتها في سياق
its needs
التنمية
in
المستدامة
relation to sustainable
وتحسينا
development,
لمجتمعاتنا
and to
من
prevent
الانغماس في
our
دوامة
communities from
الأزمات.
spiraling into crises.
على هذا الأساس سعت الجزائر إلى توفير
Accordingly,
كافة الشروط لضمان تطوير
Algeria
وديمومة
has
الأنظمة
spared no effort
الغذائية
to provide all
الوطنية
conditions necessary
وبناء على
to ensure
بناء قطاع
the
زراعي مستدام
development and sustainability
من
of
خلال
national
تنمية
food
الشعوب
systems
الاستراتيجية
and
وإدماج
agriculture sector.
الطاقات
This is
المتجددة
achieved
في
by
مجال
developing
إنتاج
strategic sectors,
الفلاحي
integrating renewable
وتثمين
energy
الموارد
in rural
الجينية
production, and
وتطوير
develop
السلالات
genetic
المقاومة
resources, as well as
والمتلائمة
developing climate
مع
change
التغيرات
and
المناخية
adaptive resilient crops.
فضلا عن توسيع السد الأخضر
Algeria
وله
is
من
also
آثار
building the
إيجابية
green belt,
في مكافحة التصحر
knowing a positive
والتقليص
impact
من
on
تدهور
fighting
الأراضي
desertification,
وحد من العواصف الرملية
land degradation,
والترابية
and
وكذلك
reducing
خفض
dust and
انبعاثات
sandstorms.
غازات الاحتباس
It also
الحراري
helps and
والتكيف
contributes
مع
to
التغير
reducing
المناخ.
CO2 emissions
سيد الرئيس،
and adapting with climate
سيدات
change.
والسادة،
Mr. President, ladies and
للمهم
gentlemen,
هنا تثمين دور هذا المجلس الموقر
the
الذي
role
يعد
of
الحفاظ
this council
على السلم والأمن
is worth
الدوليين
commending
من صميم مسؤولياته.
as it has the maintenance of international
إذ
peace and
يصبو
security as its
من
primary
خلال عقد
responsibility.
مثل هذه
By
النقاشات
convening such important thematic
الموضوعاتية
debates,
إلى رفع مستوى الوعي
the
الجماعي
Council raises public
ودق
awareness
نقص الإنذار
and sounds
حول
the
بعض
alarm in
الإشكاليات
relation to
التي
some of
تهدد
the
الأمن
problems
والاستقرار
that threaten
الدوليين
international security and
كالعلاقة
stability,
الترابطية بين
Like
ظواهر
this.
تغير المناخ والأمن الغذائي
interconnection
والنزاعات.
between climate change, food security,
من هذا
and
المنطلق
conflict.
كمساهمة لبلادي في إثراء هذا النقاش الهام يقترح
As
الوفد
contribution
الجزائري
from my country
مسارات العمل التالية:
to enrich this
أولاً،
important discussion, Algeria would
تفعيل
like to
آليات
propose
الوقاية من نشوب
the
النزاعات
following
وحلها
streams of action.
إن
First,
يعد
conflict prevention and
لاتخاذ
resolution
تدابير
mechanisms are
استباقية
necessary.
لمنع النشوب النزاعات
Taking proactive
ومعالجة
measures for
جذورها
conflict
من
prevention and
أبى
addressing the
الوسائل
root causes
التي من شأنها أن تخفف من
is crucial
المخاطر
to reduce
وتعزز
the risks
الاستقرار على المدى
and
الطويل.
promote stability on the long
ثانياً،
run.
بناء
Second,
قدرات على الصمود
building
المجتمعات.
resilient communities.
فنحن نحتاج إلى
We do
الاستثمار
need
في
to
بناء قدرة
invest
المجتمعات
in building
والنظم الإيكولوجية
the
على
resilience of
الصمود
societies and
في مواجهة
ecological systems,
آثار تغير
face of
المناخ،
the impacts of climate
وذلك
change.
من خلال دعم الممارسات
This is to be achieved
الزراعية
by
المستدامة
supporting sustainable
وتعزيز
agricultural practices
الحفاظ
and
على المياه
promote the
وإدارة
preservation of
الموارد
water as well
الطبيعية
as
بشكل
the
عقلاني.
sound management
ثالثاً،
of natural resources.
معالجة الأسباب الجذرية لانعدام
Addressing
الأمن
the root
الغذائي
causes of food
من خلال
insecurity
تشخيص
by
مكامين
diagnosing and
الضعف
identifying the
والخلل
weaknesses
في منظومة
and
الإنتاج
imbalances
وسلسلة التموين
in the production
ومعالجتها
system, supply
بشكل
chain, and
جماعي،
addressing
لا
those
سيما عبر
causes
تعزيز
collectively,
التنمية الاقتصادية
particularly by
الشاملة
developing comprehensive economic
ومكافحة
development,
الفقر وعدم المساواة
reducing poverty,
والحكم الرشيد
inequality, and
وتعزيز فرص
promoting good
وصول
governance.
منتجات زراعية للدول الجنوب
The access
إلى
of
أسواق
agricultural
دولية
products from
ورفع
the
العقبات
south
التجارية
to international
عليها.
markets should be
رابعاً،
promoted and trade
تعزيز
barriers
التعاون
should
الدولي
be lifted.
من خلال بناء
Fourth,
شراكات
enhanced
متعددة
international
الأطراف
cooperation by
لتبادل
building
المعرفة
multilateral
والموارد
partnerships to share
ودعم
knowledge and
المنظمات
resources
الدولية
and support
مثل منظمة
international
الأغذية
organizations
والزراعة
like the FAO.
والصندوق الدولي للتنمية الزراعية
IFAD
وبرنامج الأغذية العالمي
and the World Food Program.
وتعزيز التعاون في مجال استراتيجيات التخفيف
Cooperation
من
should
آثار
also be
تغير
enhanced
المناخ
in the
والتكيف
adaptation
معه.
strategies
خامسا،
to climate change.
سعي إيجاد آليات تسمح
Fifth,
للدول النامية
Mechanisms
على
should
وجه
be found to
الخصوص
help developing
بالحصول
countries
على
in
الدعم
particular
المالي
to
بالقدر الكافي
receive the
والملائم. وأخيرا،
sufficient and adequate
تعزيز فرص
financial
الابتكار
support.
والبحث
Six,
العلمي والتطوير في
promote
المجالات
innovation,
الزراعية
scientific
ذات
research,
الصلة بالتغيرات المناخية
and
والنظم
development
الإنذار
in agriculture
المبكر.
in
سيد
relation to
الرئيس، سيدات
early
والسادة،
warning and
تؤمن
climate.
الجزائر
Mr.
إيمانا
President, ladies
راسخا
and gentlemen,
بأن أنجح
Algeria
الحلول
strongly believes
لمحاربة تغير
that the
المناخ
best solution to address
وانعدام
climate
الأمن
change
الغذائي
and food insecurity
وعدم
and
الاستقرار في مختلف
instability
ربوع العالم
throughout the world
مربوطا بمدى تقيدنا
is closely
المسؤول
linked to
باحترام القانون الدولي
us upholding
الدولي
international
والالتزام بمقتضياته دون تمييز
and its
أو
provisions
ازدواجية
without
في المعايير.
discrimination or double standards.
ولنا في وضع المأساوي الذي
A case in point
يعيشه
is
سكان
the
قطاع
tragic
غزة
situation in which the
فلسطين
people of Gaza
المعرضين منذ
are living.
أكثر من 5 أشهر
For more than 5
إلى
months,
قصف مكثف
they have been
وتدمير
subjected to
إلقائي
intensive shelling and
لكل
bombing
المنشآت الحيوية
and destruction
من
of
طرف
all
السلطة القائمة
vital facilities
بالاحتلال
by the occupying
مما
power.
خلف ما يزيد عن 28 ألف شاهد
The result
وأضعاف مضاعفة من
is the
الجرحى
falling of more than
والمشردين
28,000 martyrs
وأتى على
and
الأخضر
doubles of
واليابس
these wounded and
متسببا
displaced.
في أزمة غذائية خانقة
This
وتردي الوضع
bombardment
البيئي
and
في المنطقة
shelling left
أبرز
nothing
مثال
alive. It caused
أن
a
عدم
suffocating
مراعاة
food
سلطة
crisis,
الاحتلال
deteriorating environment
لأبسط ضوابط
situation in the region.
الأخلاقية
This
وعدم
is just a proof
اكتراثها
of the
بالأطر
disregard
الدولية
by the occupying power of
الإنسانية
the
والبيئة
most basic moral principles.
والقواعد
It's
الدولية
total
الملزمة.
disregard of
وعلى
international
الرغم من فداحة
humanitarian
هذا
frameworks
المشهد
and
المروع
binding
يقف
international
المجتمع الدولي
rules.
موقف متفرج أمام
Notwithstanding the
هذه
gravity
الانتهاكات
of this horrendous situation, the
الصارخة
international
وبدل
community
العمل على وقف
stands as
العدوان
a
الصهيوني
bystander in the face of
وما
these
يترتب عنه من
flagrant
أضرار جسيمة
violations.
على
Instead of
الإنسان
putting an end to
والطبيعة
this Zionist
والبيئة على
aggression
حد
and
سواء.
its ensuing serious harms
تتعرض
on
أهم
humans,
وكالات الأمم
nature and
المتحدة
environment alike,
للإغاثة
one of the
الإنسانية
most important
لحملة التشويه
UN relief agency
ممنهجة هدفها
is
ضرب
subject to a systematic
مصداقيتها
defamation campaign, the
وتجفيف
objective of
المنابع
which is
التمويل
to
الموجهة
undermine its
لاستجابة
credibility, drying
لأبسط
up sources of
احتياجات
its funding,
السكان.
the funding that is
في هذا
addressed to
السياق
respond to the basic needs
تدعو
of the
الجزائر
people.
المجتمع الدولي
In this
وخاصة هذا
connection,
المجلس
Algeria calls on the
الموقر
international community, in
نظرا
particular this
لصلاحياته
council,
الواسعة
in light of its
التي
broad
خول
powers
له ميثاق الأمم
conferred upon
المتحدة
it by the
في
Charter of the
مجال
United
الأمن
Nations in
والسلم
relation to international peace and
الدوليين
security,
إلى تحمل
to shoulder its
مسؤوليته
responsibility
لوضع حد الفوري
to put an
لمعاناة
immediate
الشعب
end to
الفلسطيني
the suffering of the
والعمل على
Palestinian people
تحسين
and to
الأوضاع
improve
الإنسانية
the
في
humanitarian
غزة
situation
وعلى
in
إيصال
Gaza
المساعدة
and
الإنسانية
ensure
بشكل
the
عاجل
immediate,
ومستمر
continuous,
وكاف للسكان
adequate delivery
المتضررين.
of aid to
وفي
the people
الختام
affected.
بودي
In
أن
conclusion,
أجدد
I would
التذكير
like to recall
بأن
once again
التحديات
that the
المترابطة
climate change,
لتغير
food
المناخ
insecurity and
والأمن
conflict-related
الغذائي
challenges
والنزاعات تطلب إلزاما
require firm
ثابتا
commitment
وعمل متضافرا
and concerted
من
action
المجتمع الدولي
from
من
all
جهتنا
countries.
وبصفتنا
On
عضوا
our
مسؤولا
part, being
في المجتمع
a
الدولي
responsible member
فإن
in the
الجزائر
international
على
community,
استعداد التام
Algeria
للمساهمة في الجهود
is all
الجماعية
ready to contribute
لحماية
to collective efforts
السلام
to
والأمن
protect
والرخاء
peace,
للجميع.
security
أشكركم
and
على حسن
prosperity for all. Thank you for your
استماعكم.
attentive listening.
Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Sheriffa, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Michael Reagan, Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honor to be with you all today. President Ali, thank you for hosting us today. And thank you for your exemplary leadership in tackling climate and food insecurity through the Caribbean Community and Common Market. For years, climate change has been the topic of conversation on the world stage, and its impact is far-reaching, as we can see with our own very eyes. From increased crop failures to water insecurity to increasing extreme weather events, the impacts of climate change exacerbate food insecurity for many and worsen stability for all of us. No one is exempt. Those of us around the table and in this room represent every corner of the globe. I'm sure you all are aware that last year, the Horn of Africa experienced its worst drought in recorded history. The World Food Program estimated that more than 23 million people across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia face severe hunger. We know that floods in Somalia have driven close to 500,000 people from their homes, and approximately 4.3 million people are facing crisis or worse levels of hunger, exacerbating the security challenges Somalia faces. These are only a few examples of how climate change can impact lives globally. And no country is immune for these effects, not even the United States. In 2022, very low food security households in the United States increased, and roughly 36% of U.S. households with incomes below the federal poverty line were food insecure. This is simply unacceptable. Since day one as administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, I have committed tens of billions of dollars to ensuring that all people, regardless of the color of their skin, the community they live in, or the money in their pockets, have clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and the opportunity to live a healthy life. The impacts of climate change and food insecurity oftentimes disproportionately affect those most vulnerable among us. And in response, we have three interlinked priorities for transforming the food system. Thanks to President Biden's leadership, the United States is supporting food security and nutrition for all, tackling climate change mitigation and adaptation, and creating inclusive and equitable food systems that address the needs of the most vulnerable communities. Back in December at the UNFCCC COP28 in the United Arab Emirates, I was proud to launch the National Strategy for Reducing Food Loss and Waste and Recycling Organics. Food loss and waste represent 8% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. When food is wasted, so is the opportunity to nourish people. When food is wasted, so are the resources that were used to produce, process, distribute, and prepare that food. Reducing food loss and waste is critically important for our climate and will help provide social and economic benefits, leading to an increase in stability and security across the globe. The United States is also working with the UN Environment Program to help identify sources of food waste in rapidly urbanizing areas of developing countries. At the same time, it is essential that we ensure the most vulnerable have access to food. That is why the United States is honored to fund more than 1/3 of the World Food Program budget. Food insecurity is present in the United States. It's present in Guyana. It's present in rural areas and in cities. And the impacts of climate change on reducing food security can be seen both on land and at sea. With rising temperatures and ocean acidification, critical blue economy food sources are at risk, and so are the people that rely on them. As global leaders, we have a responsibility to foster conditions for increased peace and security in the world. Our work both inside and outside of this room is preventing and reducing food insecurity while addressing climate change and its impacts. We must continue to work together to achieve our goals, and we must remain relentless in that pursuit. Mr. President, thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Reagan for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Sandra Stiglitz, Deputy Minister of Foreign and European Affairs and State Secretary for Political and Multilateral Affairs and Development Cooperation of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council, and thank you for convening the open debate on the highly pressing topic of climate change and food insecurity. The Council's role in advancing prevention and sustaining peace in a world with a rapidly changing climate is essential. I would also like to thank the briefers for highlighting the complexity of interdependence of climate change, food security, and peace. Mr. President, climate change-induced weather extremes, such as droughts and floods, lead to natural resource shortages and food insecurity. Already fragile communities are usually hit the hardest. Slovenia follows with great concern how climate change has exposed millions of people in the Horn of Africa to acute food insecurity. Conflict risks escalate amid food and water scarcity. The growing gap between water supply and demand might lead to even more conflicts over water resources, arable land, and food, as we see across the Sahel. On the other hand, armed conflicts also often lead to the devastation of food systems. The war in Sudan has disrupted the crops and has left the food markets empty. The war in Gaza has devastated water infrastructure and natural environment, considerably adding to the extreme suffering of civilian population already facing severe food shortages. Slovenia is gravely concerned about the impact of war in Ukraine and its long-term consequences on global food supply chains. Compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law is of paramount importance. Finally, armed conflicts affect the human and natural environment long after the guns go silent. Soil degradation, water pollution, habitat destruction, and dangers posed by landmines and unexploded ordnance hinder recovery and restoration of food systems after the war. Mr. President, the UN system must use all tools at its disposal, including the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in addressing climate change and food insecurity. This is key to boosting inclusive, sustainable development and building resilience of affected societies. Millions around the world are bearing the brunt of the changing climate, with women, children, and older persons hit the hardest. Eating last and eating least is a daily reality of mothers in the most fragile communities. Emergency humanitarian relief and development cooperation in the field of climate adaptation and mitigation must be complemented with endeavors for peace and security, and the UN Security Council must play its part. Climate change is a defining challenge of our time. It poses direct existential threats to many UN member states, and it can act as a driver of conflicts. The transboundary nature of climate change and food insecurity demands the response of the international community as a whole. We, as the members of the Security Council, have a challenging task ahead of us, preserving peace and security in the context of addressing issues related to effects of climate change that are relevant to our mandate. We can do that by looking at all situations on the Security Council agenda through a climate-sensitive lens. Climate Security Mechanism and its network of climate security advisors can significantly contribute to that end. We can also tap into the potential of new technologies and early warning systems. Satellite imagery and artificial intelligence, as examples, revolutionize the way we predict climate threats and their impact on food and water security and migration patterns to identify potential conflict triggers before they escalate. Prevention is key. Mr. President, as this debate shows, there is a strong need for the Council to address the adverse effects of climate change and food insecurity on peace and security. Slovenia stands ready to take part in all such efforts. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Stiglitz, for her statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Alexandra Bowman, State Secretary of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, depuis la création des Nations Unies, les États membres ont réalisé ensemble des progrès remarquables. Pendant longtemps, les conflits et l'insécurité alimentaire ont reculé. Nous n'avons malheureusement pas su garder le cap. Au cours de la dernière décennie, l'insécurité alimentaire aiguë a massivement augmenté. En dépit des objectifs fixés par l'agenda 2030, près de 800 millions de personnes sont confrontées à la faim de manière chronique. Les conflits en sont la cause première, comme le montre le risque de famine à Gaza et l'insécurité alimentaire croissante au Soudan. Dans d'autres contextes, à l'agenda de ce Conseil, le changement climatique est un facteur déstabilisant. Pour promouvoir et consolider la paix, il faut mieux saisir les interactions entre ces trois dimensions. Ce débat tend donc à point nommé. Nous remercions le Guyana de nous avoir réunis autour de ce thème. Nos remerciements s'adressent également au secrétaire général, au secrétaire exécutif de la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur le changement climatique, M. Stiel, à la directrice générale adjointe de la FAO, Mme Bertol, et à Mme Leva-Roche pour l'exposé. Vos interventions ne laissent aucune place au doute. Nous avons besoin d'un multilatéralisme renforcé. Si l'objectif qui nous réunit reste le même qu'il y a près de 80 ans, le monde, lui, a changé. Les défis sont de plus en plus connexes. Nous devons donc trouver de nouveaux moyens pour consolider la paix. Le nouvel agenda pour la paix nous indique le fil conducteur à suivre, celui de la prévention. Grâce aux progrès scientifiques, divers systèmes d'alerte précoce ont été développés pour l'insécurité alimentaire, les conflits et les urgences climatiques. Nous devons maintenant nous assurer qu'ils puissent opérer ensemble. En effet, Les défis connexes exigent des systèmes en réseau permettant de relier les données. Ainsi simplement, pourrons-nous éviter les angles morts en matière de la prévention et agir pour assurer la sécurité alimentaire au long terme. Une meilleure intégration entre les différents acteurs est également nécessaire. Nous saluons la collaboration entre le Conseil de sécurité et l'ensemble du système onusien, mais également avec les organisations régionales comme l'Union africaine, les organisations régionales économiques, les acteurs locaux et la science. Dans cette logique, la Suisse a récemment organisé des dialogues sur les impacts du changement climatique et des conflits sur la sécurité alimentaire avec l'ensemble de ces acteurs. Le nouvel agenda pour la paix propose aussi des pistes concrètes pour l'action de ce Conseil. Pour parvenir à des réponses adaptées au contexte, le Conseil doit prendre en compte l'impact du changement climatique sur la paix et la sécurité. Par exemple, en mandatant les missions onusiennes d'analyser les risques liés au changement climatique. La sécurité alimentaire doit aussi faire partie de cette équation. Le Conseil doit également servir de plateforme pour l'alerte précoce et pour mobiliser les efforts de la communauté internationale. Certes, les conflits, la faim et le changement climatique interagissent de manière différente dans chaque contexte. Ce constat ressort des discussions au sein du groupe informel d'experts sur le climat et la sécurité que nous présidions avec le Mozambique, mais le résultat de cet engrenage est toujours le même. Plus d'instabilité et d'insécurité. Nous l'observons au Sahel, au Myanmar ou encore à Haïti. Pour agir contre la faim causée par les conflits, le Conseil s'est doté d'une base claire en adoptant la résolution 2417. En tant que points focaux au sein du Conseil avec le Guyana, nous sommes engagés pour faciliter sa mise en œuvre. Concernant l'impact sécuritaire du changement climatique, des progrès ont été réalisés au cas par cas dans plusieurs résolutions. Nous soutenons la recherche d'un consensus entre les membres du Conseil pour qu'ils puissent se doter d'un cadre stratégique en vue d'une action cohérente et responsable face aux défis climatiques. Monsieur le Président, les outils pour renforcer la prévention existent. Encore faut-il la volonté politique de les saisir. C'est notre devoir face aux triples fléaux des conflits, de la faim et du changement climatique. Étant donné, et Monsieur le Président, vous l'avez mentionné dans votre discours, que les populations les plus vulnérables sont affectées de manière disproportionnée, nous devons tout mettre en œuvre pour que le droit international soit respecté. Face aux souffrances causées par la violation de ces normes universelles, nous ne pouvons pas simplement compter sur la résilience des populations. Je souhaite conclure en rappelant que les défis connexes exigent des réponses intégrées. En faisant de la prévention une priorité politique, le nouvel agenda pour la paix peut nous mettre sur la bonne voie. Le sommet de l'avenir sera l'occasion de l'emprunter ensemble. Je vous remercie.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Alexandra, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Yasushi Hosaka, Parliamentary Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Mr. President, Japan highly commends your initiative to hold this important meeting. I would also like to thank the briefers for their insightful inputs. Climate change, food security, and conflict are interlinked in complex ways. Japan clearly recognizes climate change as a security issue that affects the very existence of humankind in the National Security Strategy of Japan in 2022. Japan leads the effort to address climate change in the international community. These challenges are not only critical for SHIT and other vulnerable and developing countries, but also affect international peace and security. Therefore, it is important for this Council to tackle these challenges. The Security Council must work with the determination to leave no one behind towards achievement of a world in which human dignity is protected and strengthened by addressing emerging risks such as climate change, food and energy insecurity, and infectious disease, among others. Mr. President, it is insufficient to tackle each risk separately. We believe that a comprehensive approach, including enhancing the resilience of society, is a key to building and sustaining peace. From this perspective, last year, Japan held an open debate at this Council on peace building, stressing the importance of investing in people to strengthen the resilience of society for sustaining peace. Japan also co-hosted the Area Formula meeting on conflict prevention with Guyana and Mozambique last month. At these meetings, we shared a recognition of the importance of conflict prevention and sustaining peace through a humanitarian development and peace nexus approach, which necessarily includes the empowerment of women, youth, and vulnerable people. Japan will continue to work vigorously on these issues under our upcoming presidency in March. Mr. President, we must make full use of the functions of the United Nations to better address the issue facing the international community. In particular, the Security Council could make better use of the Peace Building Commission, PBC. The PBC should continue to broaden its scope to cover matters that can affect conflicts such as those arising from climate change and food insecurity, and actively provide recommendations to the Council. Japan, as an informal coordinator between the Security Council and PBC this year, will separate no effort to enhance the close collaboration between the two bodies with a view to maintain peace and security more actively and sustainability. Mr. President, in May of last year, we issued the Hiroshima Statement for Resilience Global Food Security, together with countries representing various regions around the world. The Hiroshima Statement is a comprehensive guideline for responding to the immediate food security crisis, as well as for establishing a more sustainable and resilient agriculture and food system in the medium and long term. In this connection, we emphasize again that comprehensive approaches would be more effective at halting the increase of risks coming from climate change, as well as to break the vicious cycles that create further risks. From this perspective, Japan continues to support each country's efforts toward low emission and climate resilience development, including assistance for developing countries in both climate mitigation and adaptation. For instance, Japan has committed to mobilize up to about $70 billion in climate finance from both public and private sectors over a 5-year period through 2025 to support developing countries to combat climate change. We hope our support will contribute to alleviate the impacts of climate change, prevent spillover into food insecurity, and curb the occurrence or deterioration of conflicts. Mr. President, as I mentioned, Japan will assume the presidency of this Council next month. We will continue to actively contribute to the realization of a sustainable peace and stability based on the fundamental principle that human life and human dignity are of utmost importance. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Hosaka, for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique highly commends Guyana's presidency for convening this crucial high-level open debate on the impact of climate change and food insecurity on the maintenance of international peace and security. I have the honor, Mr. President, to convey the warmest greetings of His Excellency Felipe Jacinto Nyusi, President of the Republic of Mozambique, to Your Excellency, the President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, and the President of the Security Council. Mr. President, we welcome your participation and leadership in this debate. It bears testimony to the importance Guyana attaches to the topic of climate change as a global challenge to international peace and security. We pay tribute to the excellent presidency of Guyana in steering the difficult agenda of the Security Council during this month of February. We express our gratitude to the Secretary General for his insightful statement on the topic. We thank the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Mr. Simon Still, the FAO Deputy Director General, Ms. Beth Bechdol, and the civil society briefer, Ms. Jimena Leiva Roche, for their important briefings to the Council. Mr. President, for all we know, climate change exacerbates food insecurity, leading to social disruptions and displacement. As a consequence, the number of people suffering acute food insecurity has risen significantly, emphasizing the interconnectedness of climate, conflict, and food systems. The interplay between these phenomena presents a series of challenges for maintaining international peace and security. In fact, it is one of the most pressing challenges confronting the global community today. We in Mozambique are witnesses of the disproportionate impact of climate change and food insecurity on our own people. But like Mozambique, the most vulnerable countries of Africa and small island states have been seriously threatened by weather events and disasters. Our countries are facing acute security and development challenges, particularly in food security and cyclical occurrence of extreme events. The natural phenomena affecting them exacerbate tensions and conflicts among communities with a disproportionate impact on women and children. In this context, Mozambique associates herself with those voices and initiatives as reflected in the Security Council's resolutions 2349 of 2017 and 2417 of 2018. They call for the redoubling of our collective efforts towards promoting a great understanding of the linkages between climate and peace and security. In our view, this is critical in order to foster common understanding on the need for a better coordination of responses of solutions. We need to change the paradigm of perceptions on the maintenance of international peace and security globally so that our peoples and their rights are respected and protected against conflict-induced situations. Mr. President, the effective combat of climate change effects and the prospect for reduction of food insecurity are critical global challenges. These are issues that need to be addressed collectively with a sense of urgency and responsibility. In this regard, we praise the recent COP28 decision in which the world stressed the importance of seriously addressing climate change by providing financial and technical support to the most vulnerable nations in order for them to respond to adaptation challenges. We therefore believe that cooperation among different United Nations organs, agencies, and programs, including this Council, will strengthen our capacity to address climate change and food insecurity for the noble goal of maintaining international peace and security. Mozambique wishes to emphasize that addressing climate-related security risks requires a holistic approach that ought to take into account, inter alia, environmental, economic, social, and political dimensions in an integrated approach. It is a collective responsibility to safeguard peace and security in the face of climate challenges. By recognizing the interconnectedness of these challenges, we can work towards sustainable solutions that promote resilience, equity, and stability on a global scale. We believe all organs of the United Nations are duty-bound to work together toward this shared objective. In the words of the United Nations Charter, this is how we can, and I quote, employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you for organising this debate and to our briefers for their briefings, which have underlined the interdependence of climate, security and peace. Climate change, environmental degradation and biodiversity loss are exacerbating conflict, contributing to global food insecurity and threatening international peace and security. And as Executive Secretary Steele said earlier, the less action that is taken to address climate change, the more conflicts this Council will find on its agenda. And those who are impacted by conflict or facing severe humanitarian needs are often the least resourced to adapt to the climate and environment crises. These linked challenges require a coordinated international response, and I offer 3 approaches in this regard. First, we take early action to prevent and resolve food security crises. This was a key theme of last year's Global Food Security Summit, co-hosted by the UK, the UAE and Somalia, where the UK announced its new Resilience and Adaptation Fund to help climate adaptation and increase anticipatory approaches. We should build, too, on the successes of COP28 and increase climate finance to fragile and conflict-affected states. The UK endorsed the Emirates Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems and Climate Action, and pledged $126 million to help vulnerable countries tackle climate change, including support for early warning systems and disaster risk finance. Second, we invest in innovation to increase sustainable, climate-resilient food production. The benefits of scientific advance should be accessible to all, especially to smallholder farmers, whose plight the President highlighted earlier. The UK is driving scientific advances in food and agriculture, including through the CGIAR, Agricultural Research Organisation, and the Gilbert Initiative. Finally, President, we support humanitarian, development, peace-building and climate actors to take a holistic and integrated approach to resilience, development, security and climate change. As the President said earlier, collectively, we should ensure that current and projected climate impacts are fully integrated into conflict risk assessments. And we should target climate work in fragile and conflict-affected countries in a way that addresses the causes of crisis, while also ensuring climate finance is conflict sensitive. The UN system, including its cadre of climate security advisors, is well positioned to coordinate climate, food security and peace efforts. This Council can support this by encouraging a coherent, integrated response, including within Council mandates. President, the number of participants in today's debate underlines the concern among the UN membership at the threat these interlinked challenges pose to international peace and security. It is incumbent on this Council to respond to those challenges. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Your Excellency, President Mohamed Irfan Ali, I have the high honor of conveying the highest and warmest sentiment of President Julius Maada Bio and to extend congratulations to Guyana on assuming the presidency of the Security Council, but also for your excellent stewardship of the Council in this month. Mr. President, we thank you for organizing this high-level open debate on the impact of climate and food security on the maintenance of international peace and security. Also allow me to thank you for the reflections you've offered in your national capacity. I join Council members in thanking the Secretary General for his sobering and important briefing and his leading voice on this important issue. Let me also thank Mr. Simon Steele, Ms. Beth Botchol, and Ms. Chesmina Levi-Roche for their very valuable and informative briefings. Climate change and food insecurity should not only be discussed in terms of environmental and humanitarian context, but also as an emerging threat to international peace and security. Let me highlight in this statement the cross-regional nature of the effect of climate change and food insecurity in Africa to bring out clearly the threat to international peace and security. The scientific evidence is becoming clearer with every passing day. Climate change is altering our planet at an alarming rate, leading to rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and disruptions in ecosystems. These changes have far-reaching consequences, and one of the most pressing challenges we face is a threat to food security. As climate-related disruptions intensify, agricultural systems are increasingly susceptible to failure, exacerbating existing problems and creating new hotspots of conflict. The nexus between climate change, food insecurity, and conflict is evident in various regions across the globe. Changing weather patterns disrupt traditional agricultural practices, leading to crop failures, water scarcity, and the displacement of communities. In the face of such challenges, competition for dwindling resources often escalates tensions, heightening the risk of conflict within and between nations. From the Horn of Africa to the Sahel, there is evidence of these links between, on the one hand, the adverse impact of climate change on livelihoods, and on the other hand, increased conflict risk. The most common type of conflict risk linked to the increased livelihood insecurity is among farmers and herders over access to resources, grazing areas, agricultural land, and water, as we've also had from the WHO and FAO. In the Sahel, climate change disproportionately affects 50 million people who depend on agriculture and livestock. This is why livelihood deterioration has increased the risk of farmer-herders conflict over diminishing resources in the region. As increasingly frequent droughts and flood compound livelihood insecurity, farmers and herders are now using violence to protect their existing resources or to secure new resources. Factors such as capacities to manage dispute, legitimacy of the rule of law institutions, and availability of small arms all play a role in the scale of related violence. Mr. President, as we have heard, world hunger is an issue of global concern. A combination of factors including famine, effects of armed conflict, climate change, and global inequalities have become leading causes of food insecurity in our world and have driven millions of people to the brink of starvation. This scenario is characterized by unprecedented numbers of people displaced by conflict, catastrophic weather events, and natural disasters. Many people cannot afford enough food due to famine or conflict. It is estimated that about 70% of food insecure countries are also fragile. According to the 2023 Global Report on Food Crisis, in West Africa and the Sahel, and in part of Central Africa, the levels of acute insecurity, food insecurity, during the June-August 2023 lean season were projected to be the highest on record, driven by worsening conflict and insecurity, particularly in the Central Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin areas. Other instances have been characterized by increased economic shocks, including widespread inflation and currency depreciation. Mr. President, in light of the foregoing, Sierra Leone is of the firm view that the following actions, in addition to others, need to be taken to address climate change and food insecurity in order to maintain international peace and security. Firstly, it is imperative to integrate climate and food security into conflict prevention. This can be done through the conduct of risk assessment to identify regions vulnerable to climate-driven conflict, such as the Sahel. Building dialogue and cooperation between communities competing for resources and support for mediation and conflict resolution efforts in climate-affected regions should also be facilitated. This also involves addressing underlying grievances that can be exacerbated by climate change. Secondly, we need to invest in conflict resolution mechanisms and peace-building initiatives, encouraging also regional cooperation and collective action on climate food security. Thirdly, it is necessary to invest in climate-resilient agricultural practices like drought-resilient crops, water-efficient irrigation, and agroforestry. Additionally, Member States should support the establishment of early warning systems for extreme weather events. Furthermore, assistance should be provided to communities to be relocated away from areas prone to climate disasters. This resonates with the multi-dimensional and whole-of-system approach. In Sierra Leone, we have recognized that sustainable and climate-smart techniques are essential for a resilient food system. In this regard, under the Feed Salon program, we are promoting agricultural techniques that enrich soil fertility, improve water retention, diversify crop production, and encourage the cultivation of climate-resistant crop varieties. The main objectives of the Feed Salon program is to boost agricultural productivity, to fuel inclusive growth, increase access and availability of locally produced nutrient-dense and safe food, reduce our dependency on food imports, reduce hunger, increase export earnings, create jobs, and build a resilient food system. So let me conclude, Mr. President, by noting that the UN Security Council has a crucial role to play in addressing the intertwined threats of climate change, food insecurity, and their impact on international peace and security. The Security Council has adopted products in the past, recognizing the security risk of climate change and food insecurity and urging action for member states. This should continue, reflecting changing circumstances, situations. Finally, ECOSOC and the relevant UN funds, programs, and specialized agencies can provide the Security Council with regular briefings to inform the Council's work on the potential security implications of climate change and food insecurity, drawing on its expertise in sustainable development, humanitarian affairs, and in human rights. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
je vous remercie
President, I would like to thank you
et je vous félicite
and I
d'avoir pris
congratulate
l'initiative de
you
ce
for having
débat sur
taken the
le thème climat,
initiative for
sécurité
this debate on
alimentaire
the theme of
et
climate
conflit.
change, food
C'est un
security
sujet
and
qu'il est en
conflict.
effet essentiel
This
de
is in point
traiter
of
dans le cadre
fact
du Conseil
a
de
key
sécurité.
subject to be
Et je
addressed
voudrais
within
à
the
mon tour
Security
remercier
Council
les
and in
intervenants
turn I would like
pour
to
chacun de
thank
leurs
the
exposés qui
briefers,
ont été
each of them,
extrêmement
for
complémentaires
their
et éclairants.
very enlightening
Nous le savons
briefings.
tous, le changement climatique
We all know
aggrave
full well
les
that
contextes de
climate
fragilité
change
et il figure
exacerbates
souvent parmi les
volatile
causes
contexts,
profondes
and quite
et
often
parfois
it is among
immédiates
the
des conflits
deep-rooted and
armés.
even immediate
Et
causes
ces
of
conflits
armed
constituent la
conflict.
première cause des
These
crises
conflicts
alimentaires.
remain the primary
Ils ont
cause of
également un
food
coût en
crises,
termes
and in
d'impact
turn they
sur
have an
l'environnement,
impact
le
on the
dérèglement
environment,
climatique et la perte de
on
biodiversité.
the loss of
Sur les
biodiversity
20
and
pays les
climate
plus touchés
change.
par
Out
les
of the
conflits dans le
20
monde,
countries
12 font
hardest
partie des
hit by
pays les plus
conflicts in the world,
vulnérables aux
12
impacts du
are
changement
among the
climatique,
most
tandis que sur les
vulnerable
10
countries
pays les
to
plus
the
sensibles à ces risques, 9
impacts
sont
of climate
en
change. Well,
situation
10
d'insécurité
countries that are
alimentaire.
most sensitive
La
to
stabilité, la
risks,
paix, la
9 of
sécurité,
them
la
are in a
sécurité
situation of food
alimentaire
insecurity.
et le changement
Stability,
climatique
peace,
sont
and
intrinsèquement
security
liés.
and food security as well as
Personne ne
climate
peut
change are
ni ne doit
clearly
plus
linked.
l'ignorer.
No one can
Et
nor
c'est pourquoi
should
il est
they
si
ignore
important que
this,
notre
and
Conseil
that is
traite
why it is
sérieusement
important for
cette
the
chaîne
Council
de
to
causes et de
address
conséquences.
this cause and effect link quite seriously.
Ce Conseil le sait,
The Council knows this full
la
well.
guerre d'agression russe
The
contre
Russian
l'Ukraine
war
a
of aggression
gravement
against
exacerbé la crise
Ukraine
alimentaire
has
mondiale.
seriously
Et la
exacerbated
Russie, en tentant
the
d'empêcher le
global food
passage des denrées
crisis.
alimentaires, en
Russia is
pilonnant le
attempting
système
to
agricole ukrainien,
prevent the
le
passage,
fait au
the
détriment
arrival
des
of
pays qui souffrent le
foodstuffs,
plus
and is
de cette
destroying
crise
the Ukrainian
alimentaire.
agricultural systems
Ce
in its
Conseil
own
le
interest,
sait
to
également.
the detriment of the
Nous sommes
interests of
toujours loin de
the
l'objectif que
countries
nous nous
suffering the
étions
most
fixé en
from
2009
this
dans la résolution
food
281
crisis.
de l'Assemblée générale qui appelait
We
les
know
Nations
full
Unies
well
à
that we are
redoubler
far from
d'efforts
achieving the
face aux
objective we set
répercussions
in
du changement
2009
climatique
in
sur la
GA
paix et
Resolution
la
2 to
sécurité
81, calling on
internationale.
the UN to redouble
Et il
its
est
efforts to
essentiel de
address
mettre
climate
pleinement en
change
œuvre la
and international
résolution
peace and security,
24-17.
and to fully
L'heure
implement
n'est plus
Resolution
aux paroles, mais aux actes,
2417.
et cela passe par la pleine mobilisation
It
de
is
ce
time
Conseil.
to stop talking and to
Celui-ci doit
turn
être
to
en mesure de
action.
mieux
We
évaluer,
must be able better
anticiper,
to
prévenir
assess,
l'impact du changement climatique
anticipate,
sur
and
la paix et la
prevent the
sécurité
impact of climate change on
internationale,
international peace
notamment
and
en matière de
security,
sécurité
in
alimentaire.
particular in the area of food
Nous devons
security.
aussi
We
appeler
must
systématiquement
also
toutes les parties au
systematically
conflit
call on all
au
parties to
respect du
conflict,
droit
to
international
respect
humanitaire qui
international
interdit
humanitarian
d'utiliser
law
la faim
and
comme arme
not
de guerre.
to use hunger
Monsieur le
as a
Président,
weapon of
je
war.
souhaite pour ma part
Mr.
formuler
President,
trois propositions.
I would
D'abord,
like
ce
to make the
Conseil doit
following
être
three
informé
proposals.
de manière
Firstly, the
détaillée
Council must
sur
be
l'impact des crises
kept
climatiques
briefed
et des
in
conflits sur
detail
la
on the
situation
impact
alimentaire dans les
of
régions les plus
climate and food
vulnérables.
crises in
Et
the
nous
most
appelons les
vulnerable
représentants
regions. We
spéciaux,
call
en
on special
particulier,
representatives
à
in
nous transmettre
particular
des
to
informations
give us
précises lors
precise
de leurs
information
exposés
during their
et à
briefings,
présenter des
but
recommandations
also to
d'action
make
ciblées pour
recommendations
certaines
for targeted
zones et en
actions
particulier
in
en
certain
Afrique,
areas, in
où
particular
des
in
initiatives
Africa, where
ambitieuses prennent souvent forme,
ambitious
telles que la Grande
initiatives
Muraille
are
Verte
often taking
en la
shape, such
matière.
as the Great Green Wall.
Deuxième point, notre Conseil doit
Our
mettre
second
davantage
point is that our Council
l'accent sur la
must focus
prévention des
more
risques et nous
on
devons
risk
renforcer les
prevention, and we
mandats des
must
missions des
bolster
Nations
the
Unies afin
mandates
qu'elles
of UN
puissent venir
missions
en appui des
so
pays
that
les
they
plus
can
vulnérables
support the most
en matière
vulnerable
d'évaluation,
countries
de gestion
in the
des
area of
risques et
assessing and
proposer des
managing
actions
risk
concrètes.
and propose
Nous devons
concrete actions.
continuer enfin à
Finally,
appuyer
we
le travail
must
des Nations
continue to
Unies sur
support
le
the
terrain.
work of the UN on the
Les
ground.
conseillers climat, paix et
The
sécurité qui sont
climate, peace
déployés
and
auprès de
security
certaines missions des
advisors
Nations Unies jouent
deployed
un rôle
within
très
some
utile.
UN missions
Ils
play a
accompagnent
very
les pays dans le
useful role.
renforcement de
They
leurs
assist
capacités
countries
en
in
matière
bolstering their
d'évaluation, de
capacity
gestion des
to
risques
assess and
et
manage
travaillent aussi au
risks,
renforcement
and they
des
work
partenariats
to
avec les
increase
acteurs locaux
partnerships
et
with
régionaux.
local and regional
La France est mobilisée en ce
stakeholders.
sens,
France is
notamment
working
au
towards
bénéfice
that
du
end,
rôle
in
des Nations
particular
Unies en Afrique
with the UN
centrale,
office in
l'UNOCA.
Central Africa, UNOCA.
Nous encourageons aussi les
We
Nations
also
Unies en lien
encourage the
avec les pays
United Nations
contributeurs
in
de
line
troupes
with
à
TCCs
poursuivre la mise en œuvre de
to pursue the
stratégies
implementation
environnementales
of
au sein des
environmental
opérations de
strategies
maintien de la paix
within
elles-mêmes.
peace missions themselves.
Nous appelons les
We
États
call
membres à
on
se
member
joindre à
states
l'effort
to join
collectif
the
en
collective
adhérant
effort
au
by
mécanisme interagence
acceding to
climat,
the
paix et
interagency
sécurité des Nations
mechanism
Unies, dont
climate, peace and
l'objectif est d'intégrer
security of the
précisément le
United
changement
Nations.
climatique
The goal
de
is
manière
to
transversale dans les différents travaux
integrate
onusiens
climate change
liés
across
à la
the
paix et à la
board
sécurité
in the
par une
UN
approche
work
qui soit
related
centrée
to peace and
sur les besoins du
security
terrain
and to
et
take a
intégrée. La
field-centered
France s'y engage
approach.
également activement.
France is also
Monsieur le
committed
Président,
to
nous
this end
devons
quite
agir
actively.
ensemble et
Mr.
sans
President, we
tarder dans
must act
l'ensemble de
together
ces
and without
directions
delay
et renforcer nos
towards
efforts
that, and we must
collectifs
bolster
afin de
our
mettre en œuvre
collective
l'accord de
efforts so
Paris et
that
de
we
nous
can
montrer
implement
à
the
la
Paris
hauteur du
Agreement
défi
and
climatique.
to meet
Le
the
ministre de
challenge
l'Europe et
of
des Affaires
climate change.
étrangères de la
Minister of
France s'y
Foreign Affairs
emploiera en
of
menant
France
une diplomatie climatique
is carrying
ambitieuse
out an
pour
ambitious
notre développement, pour
climate
la paix et la
policy
sécurité
for the
et notre
development of
survie
peace and
collective.
security and
Je
our
vous remercie.
collective survival. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин президент,
Mr. President,
мы рады видеть вас,
we are pleased
приветствовать вас в кресле
to see you
председателя
and to
Совета
welcome you as
Безопасности.
the President of the Security Council.
Благодарим
We
генерального
wish to
секретаря ООН
thank the
за
UN Secretary
его
General
брифинг,
for his
внимательно
briefing, and we listened
выслушали
attentively
других
to
докладчиков.
the other briefers.
Господин председатель,
Mr.
сегодня
President,
у нас
today
есть
we have an
возможность
opportunity to
обсудить, как же
discuss how
получилось, что в
it's happened that in
2024
2024,
году в нашем мире
in today's
в одних
world, in
странах
our world,
провозглашено
in
торжество
some
высоких
countries, they're
технологий,
proclamations about the triumph of advanced technology. Competition is heating up. On GDP indicators, there are discussions about issues related to AI. And in other countries, millions of people continue to suffer from the horrific ancient scourge, which is reminiscent of the bleakest chapters in the history of mankind, the scourge of hunger. You all are well aware of the Russian position on the absence of a direct link between the climate and socioeconomic theme to the mandate of the Security Council. The Security Council, whose main mandate is the maintenance of international peace and security. We believe that what would be more productive, most productive, would be to discuss these issues at specialized fora. However, we understand how important these issues are for developing states, for the global south, which is why we stand ready today to discuss discuss from the political lens the root causes, the real root causes of the problems being encountered by the populations in developing countries. However, they need to be discussed not in a generic way, but in a linkage to specific country and regional situations in a manner that takes into account all aspects and root causes of conflict. Our Western colleagues today expatiated at length on climate change, technological patterns, the risk of undermining food supply chains, investments in development, and other trendy themes which at the same time are convenient to the Western narrative. Let's give us this some thought, however. 50, 70 years ago, when there was no discussion yet about climate change, at that time, did the population of the global south live any better? Let us, unlike, not at all. At that point, at the dawn of the founding of the United Nations, the developing world, which had for centuries been looted by the so-called civilized West, was just beginning to free itself from the shackles of colonialism, was full of hope that a new page of history was turning, that there would be no place for exploitation there of its sovereign resources, nor political diktat for colonial powers. The Soviet Union, which championed the ideals of socioeconomic justice, at that time made a meaningful contribution to these national liberation movements, which are recalled with gratitude by many regions in the world to this day. 7 decades ago, new member states of the United Nations were promised the right to realize their sovereignty, the right to independently determine their fate, to build their political economic systems in such a way as to ensure that they reflect the interests of their own peoples. The duty of the international community, first and foremost of former colonial powers, was to help new members of the international community to rise up and stand on their feet and to do everything possible to compensate for the damage wrought by centuries of colonial exploitation. Were these hopes, did these hopes become a reality? Unfortunately not. The West did not recognize its historical blame for a century of colonialism and, more simply stated, oppression of the peoples of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean Basin. There was no systemic, real policy of restitution carried out for the damage done to their development. The former colonial powers decided to tread a different path, to continue to siphon resources off their former colonies, to impose through political pressure and blackmail, which is duplicitously called special bilateral relations, to impose their visions of development paths, capitalizing on their financial and technological advantages. Although formally colonialism is a relic of the past, in fact, its most grotesque manifestations continue to flourish to this day. The discussion about the exploitation of sovereign natural resources by Western transnational companies, the transformation of the territories of developing states into an arena of geopolitical struggle, and once again, a direct military aggression against problematic sovereign countries to destroy their statehood. And this is specifically what we observed in Yugoslavia, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. The Anglo-Saxon military coalition is acting like lords in the former mandated territories, forgetting the fact that we are in 2024, not in 1904, and they are dealing with sovereign governments who may have their own views about processes taking place in the regions. President, distinguished colleagues, neocolonialist practices are the real reason for socioeconomic difficulties which the developing world is encountering. For according to the United Nations, there is no technically no acute shortage of food in the world. The problem lies with uneven distribution, where in the West there are surpluses, in developing states there's a deficit. The second region is something which economists call the price environment.
когда
Simply
крупнейшим
speaking,
производителям
when
агропромышленной
the
продукции выгодно
largest
поддерживать
agro-industrial
высокие цены на нее.
producers benefit from maintaining high
На
costs
этом
for this.
фоне
And
Запад
against this
огульно и
backdrop, the
лукаво,
West
обвиняя Россию
wantonly
в глобальном
and
продовольственном кризисе,
duplicitously blamed Russia for the global
замалчивает тот
food
факт, что
crisis.
крупнейшие
And in
западные
doing
корпорации
so, sweeps
являются
under the
главными
rug the fact that the
бенефициарами роста
major
цен на
leading
продукты
Western
питания.
corporations are the main beneficiaries of the rising
Речь
food
идет о так
prices.
называемой
We are
большой
talking about the
четверке. Это
so-called Big Four, the
американский
American Archer Daniels,
Midland, Bunch,
Bunge,
Cargill,
and
а также
Cargill, as well as
нидерландского
the
Louis
Dutch
Dreyfus,
Louis Dreyfus,
на долю которых приходится от
who
75
account
до
for
90%
75 to
глобального оборота
90%
товаров
of global
агропромышленного
trade in
комплекса.
agro-industrial goods.
Их дочерние
Their
подразделения на
subsidiaries in
Украине напрямую
Ukraine,
или через
directly or
посредников
through
владеют
mediators,
свыше 17 миллионов
possess more than
гектаров из
17
32
million
миллионов
hectares
гектаров
of the
украинских
32 million
пахотной земли.
hectares of
И,
Ukrainian
пользуясь
arable lands,
кризисной
and
ситуацией в этой стране, они
capitalizing on
нарастили
the
объемы
crisis in the
скупки
country, they have
украинских
increased the
сельхозугодий
volume of
по
buy-ups
низким
of
ценам.
Ukrainian croplands at low
По
prices.
мнению ЮНКТАД, на
According
глобальных
to
продовольственных
UNCTAD,
рынках за
on the
многие
global
годы
food market,
образовалась
for many
системная
years, a
смычка
systemic
крупных
nexus
сельскохозяйственных
has been
компаний и
established
западных
between major
биржевых
agricultural
дилеров,
companies
искусственно
and Western
провоцирующих всплески
stock
цен.
dealers who
Таким
have
образом,
contrived to
продовольственный
provoke
кризис во
price
многом имеет
surges.
спекулятивный
In this
характер.
way, the food crises are largely
А
speculative
теперь
in nature.
призываем вновь ответить на вопрос,
Now,
почему на фоне
once again, let us consider the question, why is it that against the backdrop of astronomical
угроза
profits
голода
of Western
больнее всего бьет по
agro-industrial
развивающимся
complex,
государствам с
the
растущим
threat of
населением?
hunger is most acutely
Да
felt
потому
by
что западные
developing
колонизаторы в
states
прошлом
with
сознательно
growing
затачивали
populations. This
для
is because
извлечения
Western colonizers
максимальной
in the
выгоды для
past deliberately
метрополии, а не для
cultivated
того,
them
чтобы
to
они были
extract maximum
способны прокормить
profit
свое
from
население.
the colonies and not to ensure that they are capable of feeding their
Подавляющее
own
большинство стран,
populations.
в том
The
числе
overwhelming
африканских, в
majority of
настоящее
countries,
время
including
фиксируются
African
тревожные
countries,
тенденции
where
в области
presently we are
продовольственной
observing alarming
безопасности,
trends in the area of food
обладают
security,
достаточными
have
плодородными территориями
sufficient
для
arable
выстраивания
lands to
собственного
establish their
продовольственного суверенитета.
own food
Об этом
sovereignty. This is
неоднократно
something which
говорил
was
офис
repeatedly
спецсоветника
referred to by the
генерального
Office of the
секретаря по
UN Secretary General Special Advisor on Africa.
За последние
Over the
5
past
лет на поддержку
5
сельского хозяйства
years,
донорами было выделено
donors
всего
allocated merely
4% средств,
4% of
хотя мы
funds
слышим и
for
еще
supporting
услышим крупные цифры
agriculture,
донорских
although we have heard and will
Однако
continue
отдача
to
от
hear
них
about
продолжает
large
вызывать
figures
все
of
больше
donor
нареканий со
contributions.
стороны
However, when it
государств
comes to
реципиентов.
results, there have been significant grievances from the recipient
Западные
states.
делегации постоянно
Western delegations
засыпают нас
constantly
цифрами
pepper
гуманитарной помощи,
debates
оказываемой ими
with figures about
развивающимся
humanitarian
странам.
assistance that they provide to developing
Достаточно ли
countries.
этого для
Is this
компенсации ущерба,
sufficient to
нанесенного веками
compensate
жестокой
for
колониальной
the
политики,
damage wrought by
разграбления
centuries
природных
of
богатств
brutal
и
colonialist
эксплуатации
policies, the
населения?
looting of natural resources, and the
Об этом
exploitation of the
судить не нам, а тем
populations?
государствам,
It is not for
которые от
us
нее
to
пострадали.
judge here, but rather for those states
Но хочу
that
отметить, что
suffered as a result of
объемы
these
поставляемые,
policies.
оказываемыми
But I
Соединенными
would like to note
Штатами
that
и
the volumes
союзниками
of
странам
the
глобального юга помощи
assistance provided by the
не
U.S.
идут ни
and
в
their
какое
allies to
сравнение
countries
с
of the
тем, что
global
Запад
South
менее чем за
pale
2
in
года выделил
comparison
на оружие
to
для
what
войны
the
по
West
доверенности
has
с
in
Россией
less
до
than 2
последнего украинца.
years spent on weaponry for the proxy war with Russia to the last Ukrainian.
По самым скромным
According to
подсчетам,
the
это
most
200
modest
миллиардов евро.
estimates, that is 200
И это при
billion
том,
euros.
что на все
And this despite
гуманитарные
the fact
операции на
that
2023 год
in
ВКГ ООН
2023,
запросил
UN
доноров
OCHA has
55
requested
миллиардов долларов.
from donors
И на настоящий момент
$55.2
выделено
billion
всего
for all humanitarian operations in
22,4 миллиарда.
2023, and
Вы
presently
представляете,
only
сколько всего можно было бы сделать в мире,
22.4
если бы
billion
Соединенные
was
Штаты и их
allocated.
союзники
Can you imagine how
тратили
much more could
деньги
have
на
been
содействие
done
развитию с такой же
if the
готовностью,
United
как
States
они
and
спонсируют
allies were to
войны
spend
против
money to facilitate
Но
development
сейчас
as
мы
readily
хотим
as they
обратить
spend money
внимание
to
на
sponsor
другое.
wars
Несмотря на
throughout the
все
world, but
благие
today we wish to
лозунги,
draw attention
донорская
to something
помощь
else.
западных
Despite all
стран не
of their
бескорыстна
noble
и всегда
slogans,
обставлена
Western
политическими
donor
предусловиями.
assistance has strings attached always, and
Наглядный
is always
пример шантаж
contingent on
сирийского
political
народа гуманитарной
conditions.
помощью
A
и
stark example
жестокие
is the blackmail
односторонние
of the Syrian
принудительные
people
меры,
through humanitarian assistance
прекращение
and harsh
западными
unilateral
донорами под
coercive measures and
политическими
suspension by
предлогами
Western
финансирования
donors under
БОКОР
political
в условиях
pretext of its
чудовищной
financing
гуманитарной
for
катастрофы
UNRWA
в Газе.
during a horrific humanitarian disaster in Gaza.
В этом контексте хотели
this context, we wish to draw attention to yet another threat to global food security. That is the threat of illegitimate unilateral sanctions by Western countries, first and foremost the United States, which cause suffering in states whose leaderships conduct policies that are independent and self-defined, For this reason, this is not to the liking of
Американские власти
Washington.
ведут дело к
American
принятию
authorities
законопроекта
are
под
moving towards
циничным
adopting a
названием
bill under
No
the
Russian
cynical
Agriculture Act
name, the
в целях
No
сокращения
Russian
так называемой
Agriculture Act,
зависимости
in order
третьих
to
стран от российского
decrease
продовольствия.
reliance of so-called reliance of
Инициатива,
third
которую
countries
уже
on
приняли в
Russian
Нижней Палате Конгресса,
food.
в
This
случае
initiative was already
одобрения будет
introduced at
действовать
the
5
House
лет.
of Representatives.
Это
If passed,
только
it
лишь
will
подтверждает,
remain in
что в
effect
своих
for 5 years.
неоколониальных методах
This merely
Соединенные
bears out the
Штаты и
fact that the
Security
United States and their
отказываться не
satellites have
собираются.
no intention of abandoning their
Уважаемые коллеги из
neocolonialist
развивающихся
methods.
стран,
Distinguished
не
colleagues from
обольщайтесь.
developing
Привычки и
countries,
методы
do not
бывших
be misled.
колонизаторов не
Do not be
изменились.
misled. The
Поменялась только их упаковка.
customs and the
За
methods of
каждый
the former colonial
потраченный
powers have not changed.
якобы
Only
ради
the
помощи
packaging
доллар,
here
они
has
будут
changed.
требовать от вас
For
расплатиться
each
суверенитетом
dollar they
и
allegedly spend
политической
on assistance, they will
самостоятельностью.
demand that you sacrifice your sovereignty and
Многие
political
африканские
independence.
государства уже это
Many
наглядно
African
на себя
states have
ощутили и
already
не хотят мириться
felt
с таким
this
подходом.
for themselves in a striking way, and they do
Россия
not
же
wish to
никогда не
tolerate these
рассматривала ни
approaches.
Африку, ни
Russia never
Азию, ни
viewed either
Латинскую
Africa
Америку
or
как
Asia or
пространство
Latin
для
America
извлечения
as
прибыли.
an arena for profit
Несмотря на все
generation.
чинимые Соединенными Штатами и
Despite
их
all
союзниками
of
препоны, мы
the
помогали,
obstacles erected by
помогаем
the
и
U.S. and their
будем
allies,
безвозмездно
we
помогать
helped, we
нуждающимся
continue to
во всем
help,
мире.
and we will continue to help free
Наша
of
страна
charge
взяла на себя обязательство по
those in need
выделению
throughout the world. The
финансовой или
Russian
натуральной
Federation has
форме
assumed
по
an obligation
двусторонним
to
и многосторонним
allocate
каналам
financially or
и
in
успешно
kind,
выполняет.
bilaterally, multilateral, through bilateral and
Только
multilateral
по линии
channels,
Всемирной
and we are
продовольственной
successfully
программы
carrying
ООН
this
за
out.
последние
Through the
5
World
лет мы
Food Program
предоставили
alone,
помощь
over the past 5 years, we
30
provided
государствам в
assistance to
различных
30
регионах мира
states
на сумму
in
свыше
various
300
parts of the
миллионов
world
долларов.
to the tune of more
У
than
нас накоплен
$300
значительный
million.
опыт технического
We have
содействия
accumulated
развивающимся
considerable
странам в сфере
experience
создания и развития
delivering
национальных
technical
систем
assistance to
школьного питания.
developing countries in the area
Нашим
of
основным
building and developing
международным партнером
national
в этой области
school
уже
meals
более
programs
13 лет
for more than
выступает все та
13
же
years.
ВФПО.
That same World Food Program has been our main international partner in this area.
На сегодня мы реализовали серию
To
таких
date, we
проектов на
have
сумму более
implemented
120
a series of
миллионов долларов в
such
Армении,
projects to the sum
Киргизии,
of more than $120
Таджикистане,
million in
Камбодже,
Armenia, Kyrgyzstan,
Лаосе,
Tajikistan,
Шри-Ланке,
Cambodia,
Никарагуа
Laos,
и на
Sri
Кубе.
Lanka, Nicaragua, and in
С
Cuba.
2017 года по
From
настоящее время
2017
опять же
to the
совместно с
present day,
ВФП
once again,
реализуем
together with the
проект «Долг в
World
обмен
Food
на
Program, we
развитие»
have
в
been
Мозамбике
implementing
с
a
бюджетом
project of
40
debt for
миллионов долларов.
development in Mozambique.
В
The budget
исполнение
is $40
решения
million.
президента России в ходе
Pursuant to a
второго
decision of
саммита
the Russian
Россия-Африка в
president during the
2023
second
году в
Russia-Africa
качестве
summit in
безвозмездной продовольственной
2023,
помощи
free of charge food assistance was
200
provided.
тысяч тонн зерна
This was
уже поставлено в Буркина Фасо,
200,000
Зимбабве, Мали,
tons of grain that have
Сомали,
already been
ЦАР
delivered
и
to Burkina
Эритрею.
Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, CAR, and Eritrea.
Помимо помощи развитию, в
In
последние
addition to
годы
development
Россия активно
assistance, in recent years,
занималась
Russia has
укреплением
proactively
продовольственного
been
суверенитета и
reinforcing
значительно
food
нарастила
sovereignty.
экспорт
We have
продовольствия на
significantly
мировые
stepped
рынки.
up
В
food exports on the
2023
global
году
markets. In
это уже привело
2023,
к
this has
снижению
already
индекса
resulted in the
глобальных
reduction of the
продовольственных цен,
World Food Price
рассчитываемого
Index,
Всемирной
which is
продовольственной
calculated by
организацией.
the
Мы не на словах, а на деле
FAO. We, not in
участвуем
word, but
в
indeed, have
смягчении
been contributing
продовольственного
to
кризиса.
mitigating the food
И
crisis.
несмотря на
And
беспрецедентное
despite the
санкционное давление, мы
unprecedented
остаемся
sanctions
ответственным
pressure, we
поставщиком
remain
зерновых,
a conscientious
предлагая нашим
supplier of grain,
партнерам
proposing to our
высококачественный товар
partners
по
high-quality
привлекательным
goods
ценам.
at
Благодарю.
attractive prices. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you,
Mr. President. Mr. President, let me start by thanking you for coming to the UN to preside this high-level meeting at the United Nations. I thank Secretary General Guterres, Executive Secretary Steele, and Deputy Director General Bekdal for their briefings. I've also listened carefully to the statement by Ms. Roche. Climate change is a critical issue closely linked to humanity's survival and development. China supports the international community in taking robust action to respond to the challenges posed by the climate change. With regard to the link between climate change and security, in recent years, the Council has devoted its attention to this issue on many occasions, and some consensus has emerged. However, what kind of mechanism interplay between these two factors has to be further understood. Some conflicts obviously do not have a direct linkage to climate change. Therefore, each situation should be studied on its own merit and studied to determine the causes of the situation and the points of intervention. At At the same time, we are increasingly realizing that more and more extreme weather patterns are bringing big shocks to global food production, with the developing countries bearing the heavy brunt. Such a negative impact should not be overlooked. China calls for targeted action to help the developing countries enhance climate resilience, ensure food security, and break the vicious cycle of climate, hunger, and conflict. Strengthen global humanitarian assistance. The right to food is a basic human right and should therefore be respected and guaranteed by all countries. At present, some countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are facing severe food crises and are in urgent need of international assistance. China calls on the developed countries to provide more emergency humanitarian assistance in terms of food and finance to those developing countries in need. It must be emphasized that humanitarian assistance should not be used as a tool for exerting pressure, nor should it be subject to any political conditions in Gaza. Access to humanitarian supplies, including food, which are in severe shortage, still faces mounting hurdles. In Afghanistan, tens of millions of people are suffering from lack of food and clothing in the middle of winter. This tragic reality is not acceptable. We call on the countries concerned to heed the call for justice from the international community and act responsibly to avoid greater humanitarian disasters. Second, take accelerated action to bridge the developmental divide between the North and the South. Currently, global food production is fully sufficient to feed everyone. Yet, nearly 800 million people go hungry. This is a reflection of the imbalanced and inadequate global development, which can only be fundamentally resolved through common development. The international community should take full advantage of the Summit of the Future and other opportunities to seriously address the prominent issues faced by the developing countries. The developed countries should not be satisfied with only pronouncing slogans. They should effectively deliver on their ODA and climate financing commitments and eliminate unreasonable agriculture subsidies. We must firmly reject unilateral sanctions and oppose attempts, those neo-imperialistic attempts of decoupling and breaking up the chain and the technology blockades. We must create a fair and favorable international environment for the developing countries to participate in the global market, share the dividends of emerging industries, and upgrade their own industries. Third, improve the global food and agriculture governance system. The entrenched ills, such as the pricing power monopoly by big international food dealers and the high degree of financialization of agricultural products, have created turbulence and imbalance in the global food market. We must remove the blockages and the breakpoints in the food production and supply chain and build a safe and stable, smooth and efficient, open and inclusive, mutually beneficial and win-win system of food production and supply chain. It is necessary to enhance the representation, voice, and decision-making power of the developing countries and promote a fairer and more equitable international food and agriculture governance. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Agencies and the international financial institutions should tilt towards developing countries in terms of situation analysis, policy recommendations, and assistance coordination so as to enhance the latter's ability to participate in the global food and agriculture governance. It is necessary to help the developing countries to enhance their agriculture efficiency and their ability to cope with climate change. Mr. President, whether with regard to climate change or maintaining global food security, China attaches great importance to this issue and has taken robust action. With 9% of the world's arable land and 6% of its freshwater resources, China produces 1/4 of the world's food and feeds 1/5 of its population. We have adopted the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy 2035, which focuses on developing green and climate-smart agriculture while promoting the rural revitalization strategy and the carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goals. China has put forward the Global Development Initiative and the International Food Security Cooperation Initiative with a view to helping the developing countries improve their capacities in food production, storage, and the reduction of damage and loss. Under the South-South Cooperation Framework of the FAO, China ranks first among the developing countries in terms of financial assistance provided, the number of experts dispatched, and the number of projects executed. At the end of last year, more than 130 countries, China included, signed the UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food System, and Climate Action in Dubai. We can say with confidence that China is a real practitioner and actor in this regard. We are ready to work with other countries to implement the outcome of the COP28 and make a greater contribution to addressing climate change and maintaining food security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea congratulates Guyana for holding this timely open debate under the presence of His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Irfan Ali, the President of Guyana. I thank the Secretary General for his remarks, and Mr. Simon Steele, Ms. Beth Beckdahl, and Dr. Jimena Roche for their well-grounded and insightful briefings. The Republic of Korea aligns itself with the statement to be delivered by Nauru on behalf of the Group of Friends on Climate and Security. And in our national capacity, my delegation's remarks will revolve around the following three questions. First, how do the interlinkages play out between climate change, food insecurity, and peace and security in the situations on the Security Council's agenda? To start from Asia, in Myanmar, Cyclone Mocha hit conflict-affected and food insecure areas, including Rakhine State last May. The devastating impacts of the cyclone on livelihoods and shelters were exacerbated by conflict dynamics, which involved restrictions to humanitarian access. In Afghanistan, continued droughts amplify food and water insecurity and contribute to displacement. Women and girls are left particularly vulnerable due to the Taliban's violations of human rights and restrictions on aid delivery. Research also shows that prolonged drought and hunger has led to increased gender-based violence in the country. And in South Sudan, UNMISS reports that the El Nino effect is driving acute hunger in some parts of the country. In addition, shifting rainfall patterns have intensified farmer-herder conflicts. These are only a few examples, and it is clear that these dynamics deserve the thorough deliberations of the Security Council. Second, how can the Council better coordinate with other mechanisms in and out of the United Nations? Solutions require a long-term approach and partnership. We need early warning systems that incorporate climate, environmental data, and socio-economic factors related to food systems and conflict. We also need climate-sensitive peacemaking efforts as well as conflict-sensitive adaptation. In this regard, the Peace Building Commission has great potential. We encourage the PBC to convene climate-focused country or region-specific meetings with the participation of UN missions and agencies, UN climate security mechanism, and multilateral development banks. This will be relevant, in particular, for countries and regions being discussed both in the Council and the PBC, or those planning transitions along the peace continuum. By sharing respective analysis and best practices on addressing climate, food, peace linkages in that specific context, agencies could streamline and complement activities, while funding mechanisms could identify needs for resources. Meetings could sometimes take the format of PBC ECOSOC joint meetings, and the results could be sent to the Security Council as PBC's advice. Third, what support can the wider UN membership provide in this context? Building local-level resilience in vulnerable areas is not only effective but also a cost-efficient way towards both conflict prevention and peace building. In this connection, I would like to introduce the K-Rice Belt Initiative, announced by my President Yoon Suk-yeol at the G7 summit last year. This innovative project currently aims to assist 10 sub-Saharan African countries in localizing and improving rice production capacity by sharing high-yield rice varieties and agricultural technology. My delegation also records the unique and existential threats that low-lying coastal communities and the small island states currently face. Indeed, sea level rise and its impacts such as soil erosion, salinization, and land loss will destroy agricultural livelihoods and many may even cause mass displacement. The Republic of Korea continues to actively join efforts in addressing this urgent challenge as a champion country of the Coalition on Addressing Sea Level Rise and its Existential Threats, CSET for short, and as a proud sponsor of the Rising Nations Initiative for Pacific Atoll countries. Mr. President, the ROK announced climate, peace, and security as one of its guiding priorities during its council term. This is in line with the ROK's ongoing efforts to strengthen partnership with the Global South in their transition to clean energy and climate change adaptation, including by scaling up our Green ODA. As a new pledger of the joint pledges on climate, peace, and security, we hereby reaffirm our commitment to advance this agenda in the Council and, more importantly, translate it into actual results on the ground. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
President, Malta thanks Guyana for organizing today's timely debate and for placing the spotlight on the nexus between climate change and food insecurity. We also thank the briefers for their insights. Malta also aligns itself with the statement to be delivered later today by Nauru on behalf of the Group of Friends of Climate and Security. As a threat multiplier, climate change has increased resource-based conflicts in several parts of the world, exacerbating instability and challenging resilience amongst vulnerable populations. Evidence shows that persons living in conflict-afflicted areas face or are at risk of facing acute food and water insecurity or starvation. Women and girls currently account for 70% of the world's hungry, with the climate crisis further deepening pre-existing gender inequalities. 75% of all stunted children under the age of 5 live in countries affected by armed conflict. These figures speak for themselves. Understanding the link between agriculture and food systems and climate change's impact on this link is central to today's discussion. Climate-related impacts jeopardize agri-food systems and water resources, which, in turn, fuel competition over limited availability of natural resources, driving population mobility and displacement. When coupled with a vicious cycle of rising temperatures, floods, droughts, and other extreme weather events, the reality becomes devastating and is felt across the globe in various ways. Rising ocean temperatures and sea levels are impacting livelihoods in small island developing states in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The El Niño driven through the Horn of Africa has been ravaging millions of populations and their livelihoods with severe water shortages and dry pastures. The ongoing conflict in Sudan has left almost 18 million people facing acute hunger, 10 million more than last year. The situation has been further exacerbated by compromised food production. Food insecurity in the Sahel has tripled, leading to the fastest growing displacement crisis. We therefore require a holistic and integrated approach within the UN system, including at the Security Council. We recall, amongst other initiatives, the Council's unanimous recognition through Resolution 2417 of the need to break the vicious cycle between armed conflict and food insecurity, as well as the unlawful denial of humanitarian access. We also thank humanitarian workers for their tireless efforts. Their selfless actions deserve our full respect and recognition. President, Malta's commitment remains steadfast in addressing these challenges. As initiators of the joint pledges on climate, peace and security, Malta reiterates its call for synergies to be met with concrete solutions, with a focus on strengthening early warning, anticipatory action, and climate-resilient agriculture and food systems. We support the work of climate, peace and security advisors engaged with select UN peacekeeping missions and special political missions, whose role remains crucial in identifying climate-related impacts on the ground. In all our actions, we must involve local actors. These include women, human rights, and environmental defenders. We encourage that climate financing also reaches grassroots women's organizations that are leading local adaptation and mitigation efforts. Traditional and religious leaders also have an important role to play in ensuring cooperation. To conclude, President, we remain firm in our belief that we must seek to immediately respond to the root causes of food insecurity. These include breaking the cycle of conflict and addressing climate change. The Council has a responsibility to bear. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Permítame iniciar esta intervención reconociendo su presencia en este foro, lo cual engrandece la visión de la comunidad internacional y este Consejo de Seguridad. Además, agradezco a su país por la organización de este debate abierto que aborda una temática que concierne a la comunidad internacional en su conjunto. Agradezco también a los expositores por sus valiosas intervenciones. Ecuador se suma al discurso que realizará Irlanda a nombre del Grupo de Amigos de la Acción contra el Conflicto y el Hambre, que tenemos el honor de copresidir. Los conflictos reducen la productividad agrícola, destruyen la infraestructura y alteran los mercados agroalimentarios por la disrupción de las cadenas logísticas de suministros. Con más de 250 millones de personas que padecen hambre aguda, pertenecientes a un tercio de los miembros de esta organización, de los cuales la mayoría se encuentra en situaciones de conflicto y violencia armada, centrarnos en este tema es vital.
And out of that number, the majority
Presidente,
are in situations of conflict
la
and
adopción
armed
unánime de la
violence.
resolución
Mr. President,
2417
the unanimous
en el año
adoption of
2018
Resolution 2417
logró brindar a este
in
Consejo una de las
2018
herramientas más
gave this
valiosas de alerta
Council one of the
temprana
most
y respuesta.
valuable tools
En
for early
situaciones de
warning and
conflicto,
response.
los efectos
In
adversos del
conflict
cambio
situations,
climático y
the
la
adverse
inseguridad
impact of
alimentaria
climate change and
exacerban la
food
migración
insecurity
y el desplazamiento
exacerbate
forzado.
migration
En este
and forced
contexto,
displacement.
la ayuda
In
humanitaria
this
no puede
context,
detenerse.
humanitarian aid
Este
cannot
Consejo
wait.
debe
This
asegurar el
Council must
cumplimiento de la
ensure
resolución
compliance with Resolution
2573 sobre
2573
protección de bienes
on the
esenciales
protection of
copatrocinada por
essential
mi
goods
país en
co-sponsored by
2021.
my country in 2021.
Condenamos cualquier práctica de hacer
We
padecer
condemn
hambre a
any
la población
practice to
usada
starve
como
a
táctica de guerra.
population and the use of this
En nuestra
practice
región
as a tactic of
se
war.
pueden evidenciar
In
los
our
devastadores
region, we can
efectos
see
del
the
deterioro en
devastating
materia de
impact of
seguridad
the
y
worsening
sus
security
repercusiones en la
situation
crisis
and its impact
alimentaria,
on the
por
food
ejemplo, en Haití.
crisis, for example, in
Por ello,
Haiti.
en
For that
julio del
reason, in July
2023,
of
con la resolución
2023, in Resolution
2692,
2692,
este Consejo instó
this
a todas las
Council
partes,
urged all
incluidas
parties,
aquellas con capacidad de
including
influir
those
en los
with
grupos
the
armados,
capacity to
que
influence the
tomen
armed
medidas
groups,
para que no se
to
siga
take
bloqueando el
measures
acceso a
to
alimentos
put an end
y separen los daños
the
a fuentes
blocking
de
of food
suministro.
access and the
En la
damaging
actualidad,
of sources
el impacto de los
of
conflictos
supply.
en la seguridad alimentaria
Currently, the impact
se ve
of
agravado
conflicts
por la
on
crisis
food
climática.
security has been worsened
Esta
by
actúa
the climate
como un
crisis.
multiplicador de
This
amenazas
is a
al
threat
poner en peligro la
multiplier
seguridad de los
as it
sistemas
endangers
agroalimentarios,
the
los
security
medios
of
de vida
agri-food
y los
systems,
recursos
means of
hídricos.
livelihood and water
Señor Presidente,
resources. Mr.
el
President,
Ecuador apoya las
Ecuador
iniciativas del Secretario
supports
General,
the Secretary
como el
General's
Sistema de Alerta
initiatives,
Temprana para
such
Todos
as
y
the
el
system
Canal
of early
Acelerador
warning
para
for
la
all
adaptación al
and the
cambio
accelerated
climático,
channel for climate
diseñados
change
todos
adaptation,
para los países más vulnerables,
designed
así como las
for the
actividades del
most
Programa
vulnerable
Mundial de
countries,
Alimentos.
and we also welcome the activities
En esa
of the
línea de
World Food
acceso al
Programme.
financiamiento es
Similarly,
prioritario.
access to financing
Una
is a
acción climática
priority.
robusta de los
Robust
países en
climate
desarrollo
action
solo
for
será
developing
posible si
countries will
cuentan
only be
con la
possible
provisión de
with the
financiamiento
provision
climático
of
por parte de los
climate
países
financing
desarrollados,
coming from
de
developed
acuerdo con el
countries,
principio
in
de
accordance with the
responsabilidad
principle
comunes
of
pero
shared
diferenciadas.
but differentiated
Es menester hacer
responsibilities.
operativo el Fondo de
We
Pérdidas
must
y Daños con la
operationalize the
provisión de
loss and
fondos
damage
nuevos,
fund by
adicionales
providing
y
new,
predecibles.
additional and predictable funding.
Adicionalmente, y además de
Additionally,
trabajar con herramientas ya existentes
work
como el
with
Fondo de Consolidación de la
existing tools,
Paz
such as
y la
the
Comisión de
Peacebuilding
Consolidación
Fund
de la
and the
Paz,
Peacebuilding
los
Commission,
mandatos de las
the
misiones de
mandates
paz
of peace
deben
missions
incorporar la
must
recopilación de
include
información sobre los
data
fenómenos
on
meteorológicos
weather
que pueden
phenomena
poner en riesgo
which can
la
put
seguridad alimentaria de la
the food
población
security of
e
peoples at
identificar
risk,
posibles focos de
and we must
violencia.
identify possible
Este debe ser
hotbeds
un
of
trabajo
violence.
conjunto entre las
This
oficinas
must be work
país
done
y los
together
programas de las
with the
Naciones
country
Unidas como el
offices
PNUD
and
y
UN
la FAO,
programs such as the
de modo que la
UNDP
aplicación
and
de
the
la Agenda
FAO,
2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible y sus 17
so
objetivos
that
avancen
implementing
de la
Agenda
mano con la
2030
consolidación de la
for
paz.
the SDGs
No vemos
and
otra
its
manera.
17 goals
Finalmente,
will
señor
go
presidente,
hand in hand with peace building.
garantizar
Finally,
es
Mr.
necesario
President,
establecer que
we
vivimos
must
en un mundo de conflictos, de
recognize
varias
that we
guerras.
live in a world
Por ello,
of conflicts
garantizar el
of different
respeto
natures,
del derecho
and
internacional
therefore
humanitario
guaranteeing
es esencial
respect
para
for
prevenir la
international
degradación
humanitarian
natural
law
y la
is
inseguridad
essential to
alimentaria en
prevent
situaciones
the
de conflicto.
natural breakdown of
Las
the
partes
system and
beligerantes
food insecurity in
deben
conflict
conducirse las
situations.
hostilidades
The warring
respetando las
parties must
disposiciones del
conduct
derecho internacional
hostilities
humanitario
respecting the
sobre la
provisions
protección del
of
medio ambiente
international
natural,
humanitarian law
que tienen una
on
relación
the
directa con la
protection of the
seguridad
environment.
alimentaria,
This is directly
incluyendo la
related to food
contaminación
security,
o la pérdida de
including
acceso a las tierras de cultivo
contamination
y
of
fuentes
or
de agua.
loss of access to arable land
Frente a
and
este
water
escenario,
resources.
tenemos el
Against
reto de
this backdrop,
renovar
our
el
challenge
sistema de
is to
seguridad
renew
colectivas
the
con
collective
propuestas que
security
reduzcan los
system
riesgos
with
y aborden las
proposals
amenazas,
to reduce
poniendo
threats
la
and address
prevención
challenges
en el
and
centro
put
de la estrategia.
prevention
Muchas
at the
gracias.
heart of our strategy. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement. On behalf of the Council, I should like to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Luis Abinader Corona, President of the Dominican Republic, and I give him the floor.
Muchas gracias, excelentísimo señor Mohamed Irfan Ali, presidente de la República Cooperativa de Guyana y de este Consejo por el mes de febrero. Honorables miembros de este Consejo, distinguidos panelistas, señoras y señores. Felicitamos la convocatoria a este debate crucial y la valiosa contribución de los panelistas de hoy. Durante su mandato en este Consejo, República Dominicana abogó por una consideración integral de todas las amenazas a la paz y seguridad globales, incluyendo el cambio climático y la inseguridad alimentaria. En 2020, lideramos la adopción de una declaración presidencial que marcó un hito en la consideración de la seguridad alimentaria, subrayando la importancia de sistemas de alerta temprana. Nos esforzamos en proteger nuestra producción de alimentos ante desafíos climáticos y crisis que amenazan el suministro global y la agroindustria. La política oficial está respaldada por la Ley 589-16, que creó un Sistema Nacional para la Soberanía y Seguridad Alimentaria y Nutricional. En este mismo sentido, y conjuntamente con el presidente Ali, mi gobierno ha impulsado una alianza estratégica con Guyana que busca garantizar la autonomía de nuestros países en renglones estratégicos para la alimentación y la energía. Estamos conscientes de que el desarrollo global depende de satisfacer de manera adecuada las necesidades alimenticias y nutricionales, algo que ningún país aisladamente puede enfrentar. Por eso resulta fundamental para la República Dominicana la celebración de la cuarta conferencia sobre los pequeños estados insulares en desarrollo, a celebrarse en Antigua y Barbuda el próximo mes de mayo, por lo cual aprovecho el momento para agradecer a mi amigo el presidente, el primer ministro Gastón Brown, por su convocatoria. Esta es una oportunidad para exigir a los responsables del cambio climático acciones urgentes encaminadas a enfrentar la crisis y a fortalecer la seguridad alimentaria en todo el mundo. De hecho, señor presidente, de acuerdo a una investigación científica recién publicada en la revista especializada Science Advance, el sistema regulador de las temperaturas de las corrientes en el Océano Atlántico se acerca a un punto de inflexión devastador, debido al derretimiento más rápido de lo esperado de los glaciares y las capas de hielo del Ártico. Esto implica que el nivel del mar en el Atlántico aumentaría 1 metro en algunas regiones, inundando muchas ciudades costeras, como ya viene ocurriendo en nuestro Caribe insular. Las vulnerabilidades climáticas y la escasez de alimentos incrementan el riesgo de violencia, especialmente donde imperan la pobreza, el hambre y la desigualdad. Es alarmante e injustificable el uso del hambre como arma de guerra para someter a una población. Lamentablemente, esta atroz práctica se extiende cada año por el planeta. Este Consejo ha debatido ampliamente sobre respuestas contundentes a este crimen que amenaza la estabilidad global, pero es necesario intensificar nuestras acciones. Señor presidente, según el Informe Mundial sobre las Crisis Alimentarias 2023, unos 258 millones de personas se enfrentaban en 2022 a niveles agudos de hambre en 58 países o territorios, y demasiados de estos seres humanos se encontraban al borde de la inanición. En los últimos 7 años, la población en situación de hambre aumentó 146%, lo que indica que será muy difícil cumplir con el objetivo número 2 de la Agenda 2030 de crear un mundo libre de hambre. Uno de esos países es Haití, con el que República Dominicana comparte una misma isla. Según el Programa Mundial de Alimentos PMA, casi la mitad de la población de ese país vecino, es decir, 5 millones de personas, sufren hoy de inseguridad alimentaria aguda. Esta situación es en gran parte atribuible a 2 factores. Primero, la escalada de violencia generada por las bandas criminales que controlan gran parte del territorio de Haití y que, deliberadamente, obstaculizan el acceso de la ayuda humanitaria y segundo, al persistente impacto de fenómenos climáticos que no pueden ser debidamente atendidos y prevenidos por las autoridades de ese país debido a la violencia terrorista y al descalabro institucional. A través de sus resoluciones 2645, 2653, 2692, 2699 y 2700, este Consejo de Seguridad ha aprobado una misión multinacional de apoyo a la seguridad en Haití, un embargo de armas y municiones y un régimen de sanciones para los actores nocivos en el conflicto interno. Sin embargo, aún no se ha actuado con la debida contundencia y urgencia para desplegar dicha misión o para darle el carácter sólido que el régimen de sanciones amerita. La comunidad internacional no debe permitir que la catástrofe que vive el pueblo haitiano continúe un día más. Señor presidente, adoptar acciones preventivas, sensibles y oportunas a los conflictos es vital. Necesitamos herramientas de información, análisis y acción concertada para abordar la inseguridad alimentaria exacerbada por el cambio climático y los graves conflictos internos. El compromiso activo del secretario general, los Estados miembros, las agencias especializadas, las organizaciones no gubernamentales humanitarias y las comunidades afectadas es clave para avanzar en este frente. Pido a este Consejo de Seguridad redoblar sus esfuerzos para generar esas herramientas y poner en marcha un sistema de alerta temprano para permitir actuar a tiempo antes de que las situaciones se tornen en crisis más difíciles de resolver. Presidente Ali, distinguidos miembros del Consejo de Seguridad, concluyo reafirmando el compromiso de República Dominicana para lograr una seguridad alimentaria estable, una gestión adecuada del cambio climático y una paz duradera sobre la faz de la tierra. Gracias por su atención.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abiender Corona for his statement. I now give the floor to Georgos Petraitis, His Excellency Mr. Georgos Petraitis, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Greece. Please.
Mr. President, dear members of the Council, I would like first of all to thank the Permanent Mission of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana to the United Nations for the invitation to participate in today's debate, as well as the briefers for their stimulating remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, in the contemporary world, there is not a single challenge that does not interact with others. Climate crisis threatens food security, and they jointly threaten stability and social cohesion. And there is not a single challenge that applies merely to a country or a region. The collapse of the grain initiative in Ukraine threatens the grain chain altogether, and the fast ice melting on the Antarctic affects the globe. And this, while more than 600 million people worldwide are projected to face hunger in 2030. The Mediterranean Sea, the crossroad of three continents, is an illustrative example of interaction and spillover of such phenomena. The annual temperature of the sea is 1.54 Celsius higher than pre-1990 levels and about 0.5 Celsius more than the global average warming. Temperature increase has caused serious environmental damage. The Mediterranean basin has become, in the last year, the hotspot of the climate crisis, with extensive wildfires and catastrophic floods. Further, the rise of the sea level endangers the quantity and quality of fisheries and fish stocks and, in turn, people's lives and health. Mitigating global warming, advancing sustainable tourism and green shipping, and reducing microplastic pollution will be in the agenda of the 9th Our Ocean Conference that we'll be hosting in Athens on the 16th and the 17th of next April. The conference will be the bridge between COP28 and the UN Conference on Oceans next year, aspiring to produce tangible milestones and credible commitments. In the same vein, Greece will take the initiative of a nexus between climate, peace, and security, setting it as a priority of its candidacy as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for 2025-2026. However, no conference or a single state intervention may bring astonishing results. This is equivalent to Sisyphus eternally and repeatedly rolling a heavy rock up a hill. The complexity and extraterritoriality of the challenges call for collective reaction of governments and peoples of the world with a view to the future. What we need is a different mindset when it comes to environmental protection and food security. Such a cross-cutting policy is WHO's One Health project, an integrated, unifying approach to balance and optimize holistically the health of people, animals, and the environment. We need this type of new vision of global solidarity and intergenerational sustainability through ethical and rule-based global governance and fair burden sharing among the states. This is why we call for a universal alliance for sustainability, and we endorse the proposal for the appointment of a UN Special Envoy for a sustainable future. We owe it to the future generations from whom we have admittedly detached a significant portion of their natural dividends. After all, we must not forget, we are not owners, but merely caretakers on Earth. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Gerard Petros. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Panketu, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Thailand.
Mr. President, I wish to congratulate Guyana for assuming the presidency of the UN Security Council for this month of February. I also wish to thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres and all the briefers for their valuable insights and recommendations. Mr. President, despite decades of progress in development, our sense of safety and security remains low. The UNDP's 2022 special report, New Threats to Human Security in the Anthropocene, explains such a development paradox that we are all facing. From the pandemic, inequalities, and rising geopolitical tensions to devastating climate-related weather events and food insecurity, these challenges have reversed decades of development gains. I concur with the report's recommendations that addressing these threats would require policymakers to consider protection, empowerment, and solidarity alongside one another so that human security, planetary considerations, and human development all work together. Without sustainable development, a sustainable planet and human rights, peace, and security will be out of reach. That is why this open debate, focusing on climate change, food insecurity, and peace, is so timely. As policymakers, what can we do? I wish to offer the following 3 points. First, we should ensure that our institutions, policies, and priorities match the people's needs and expectations. People expect to be protected from violent conflict, adverse impacts of climate change, and food insecurity. People also expect to be empowered with basic human rights, be they health care or education, so that they can attain better living standards. Therefore, a people-centered approach should be at the core of our efforts in all aspects to ensure human development and human security for the peoples. If peace and security is to be sustained, the Security Council should have human security as part of its deliberations. With human security as our goal, there can be a stronger integrated response within the UN to our present-day challenges. Strengthened coordination between the Security Council and other relevant UN bodies, especially ECOSOC, is vital. Second, climate change is the defining crisis of our time and will continue to affect our lives in multiple dimensions. Climate change is a threat multiplier, respects no borders, and poses an urgent and serious threat to all of us, especially to LDCs and SIDs. So our approach should also be planet-centric. We must work together to address this crisis under the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC, together with its Paris Agreement, remains the cornerstone of global climate governance and should be upheld. However, developing countries need support to enhance their capacity to adapt and become more resilient to adverse impacts of climate change. Thailand reiterates the call for developing countries, echoed by the UN Secretary General at the Third South Summit, for existing financial commitments to be met by developed countries to deliver $100 billion annually and to double adaptation finance. This is not only an investment in the future of the planet, but also in human security and in peace, stability of states and societies. Third, global challenges such as climate change, food insecurity, and conflicts are interconnected. They require systematic and integrated consideration to address solutions for the people and the planet. People-centered and people-centric approaches should be the way forward for our sustainable and peaceful future. Our efforts to overcome today's global challenges, as well as new threats to the future, require global solidarity, commitment, and partnership. Multilateralism and international cooperation are the most viable solutions to addressing such challenges. In this light, we look forward to the Summit of the Future as an opportunity to reinvigorate the multilateral system with the UN at its core. And to renew our vision for peace, which should be a comprehensive one, taking into account sustainable development and human rights. As a candidate for the UN Human Rights Council for the term 2025 to 2027, Thailand hopes to make the work of the HRC more impactful, especially for individuals on the ground, many of whom are in conflict situations. It is our belief that UN organs and mechanisms need to work to complement each other in light of the multifaceted challenges we are facing. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Panketku, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Saniar, State Secretary of the International Development of Norway.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic and Baltic countries, namely Denmark, Finland, Estonia, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, in addition to my own country of Norway. And I'd like to start by thanking the Cooperative Republic of Guyana for organizing this very timely debate. We agree with several of the previous speakers that food security has become a global and national security issue, exacerbated by climate change, conflict, and economic turndown. And these common challenges can only be addressed by dedicated multilateral action. And that's what makes this such a highly relevant topic for the Security Council's agenda. The intertwined crises of climate change, conflict, and food insecurity are unfolding at a time of increasing instability and growing geopolitical tensions. Climate change and conflicts are both in many ways causing food insecurity, for example by destroying livelihoods, by increasing scarcity of resources and by disrupting supply chains. Many countries and regions that are the most vulnerable to the negative effects of climate change are also those that are suffering from conflicts and instability, and hence facing increased risks of food insecurity. Among the most severely affected are often women and girls. President, in ongoing conflicts, food is being used as a weapon. Recalling Security Council Resolution 2417, there is a clear obligation not to attack civilians or civilian objects necessary for food production. The obligation to facilitate full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need must always be respected. Upholding peace and security is the main responsibility of the Security Council, and for the Nordic and Baltic countries, it's clear that conflict prevention should be front and center of these efforts. That means that all countries need to redouble our efforts to tackle climate change and prevent and resolve conflicts in order to decrease risks of food insecurity. So let me emphasize what we consider now the 6 most important among preventive measures to fight hunger. First, taking action to prevent conflict related to climate change and food insecurity, which can be done by mitigation and adaptation, as well as strengthening early warning and early action, as well as by risk reduction. We need to generate sophisticated data and analysis. And so we support the Secretary-General's call for early warnings for all and universal access to climate information systems. Second, climate-robust agricultural development among small-scale food producers must be scaled up. Local food sector value chains and markets must be strengthened. The effects will be increased food security in the poorest rural areas, new jobs, more stability, and reduced forced migration. Third, climate finance to develop sustainable agriculture must be increased. Fourth, healthy soil is a prerequisite to fight hunger and strengthen national and global security. And seeds and fertilizer needs to reach the small-scale farmers. And so we welcome the Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit to take place in Nairobi in May. Fifth, empowerment of women, crucial to fostering food security. Women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all peace-building efforts, as well as in climate mitigation and resilience building, is an essential part of comprehensive security efforts. And sixth, we need to integrate our humanitarian assistance and our long-term development assistance much better to stop negative trends on hunger and poverty. Finally, we welcome Brazil's global leadership as the G20 chair and the important initiative to establish a global alliance against hunger and poverty. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Sanyar, for her statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of the members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. This meeting is now suspended.